They never planned to let you out. That is the theory. Not a guess, not a stretch. A conclusion drawn from 200 years of evidence scattered across every vault record, every overseer's terminal, every city that rose from a sealed door, and quietly became the same thing the old world was. The vaults were not shelters, they were laboratories, and the subjects were never told they had been enrolled. Welcome to this quiet journey through the Fallout universe's most unsettling theories. These are the ideas that live beneath the official story. The patterns that emerge when you read the records closely and stop taking the marketing materials at their word. Let me know in the comments where you are listening from tonight, and if these calm explorations are something you find yourself returning to, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next one. The hum of recycled air moves through the darkness. Somewhere deep below the surface, a vault is still running. The first theory begins not with a broken experiment, but with one that worked. Vault-Tec designated certain vaults as control vaults, facilities with no assigned variable, no unusual population, no deliberate disruption built into the design. They were meant to function normally. And in the case of Vault 8, found in the records of Fallout 2, that is precisely what happened. The residents followed protocol. The Overseer maintained order. The door opened on schedule. Those people went on to build Vault City, a functional advanced settlement with medical technology far beyond anything else in the region. But Vault City was not a success story. Its citizens were deeply hostile to outsiders. They withheld medicine from dying people who stood at their gates. They maintained a rigid class structure that separated full citizens from those deemed lesser. They were, in almost every measurable way, the pre-war world in miniature. Rebuilt from scratch with all the same instincts toward control, suspicion, and hierarchy. The theory holds that this outcome was never a failure. The control vault was not a baseline against which other experiments were measured. It was itself the experiment. Sealed rooms, artificial authority, managed scarcity. These conditions produce predictable results, regardless of what additional variable is introduced. The vault structure alone was sufficient to shape a population in the image Vault-Tec preferred. That may have been the design all along. Vault City's authoritarianism did not emerge from its experiment. It emerged from its architecture, and that leads directly to the people who were placed in charge of it. Across every vault in the known records, Vault 101, Vault 11, Vault 75, and dozens more, overseers trend in the same direction. They restrict movement, they enforce silence. They respond to questions with punishment. The pattern is too consistent to be coincidence. And the theory that explains it is straightforward. The overseer position was not designed to produce leaders. It was designed to produce controllers. The terminal records preserved across Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 suggest that Vault-Tec's selection process for overseers was built around specific psychological traits: deference to authority, comfort with isolation, preference for rule enforcement over problem solving. These were not the qualities of someone equipped to guide a community through a crisis. They were the qualities of someone who could be trusted to keep a population in place and report upward without resistance. Vault 101's overseer sealed the door against all outside contact long after the bombs had ceased to matter. Vault 11's overseers permitted an annual killing of one of their own residents for generations. Vault 75's overseer ran a combat training facility using children as raw material. This was not a flaw in the selection process. The selections process worked exactly as designed. What it was designed to do is the question. A pale light flickers in the corridor. Dust rests undisturbed on every flat surface. The recycled air carries the weight of sealed decades. The answer to that question may lie not with Vault-Tec at all, but with whoever stood behind it. The corporate records of Vault-Tec, where they can be recovered from terminal entries in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, contain consistent references to an unnamed government partner in the Vault program's development phase. This partner is never identified directly. It is referenced through language that implies oversight. Approval requirements, compliance structures, channels of authorization that flow upward past Vault-Tec's own executive tier to something larger and less visible. The theory holds that this partner was the forerunner of what later became the Enclave, the pre-war federal government's hidden continuity apparatus. Vault-Tec, under this reading, was never a private company that happened to win a government contract. It was the public face of a program conceived and directed by the federal government from the beginning. The executives who appeared in boardrooms were administrators. The real decisions were made elsewhere. The Fallout television series lends weight to this reading. In the events of its first season, a Vault-Tec board meeting is depicted that includes a figure whose authority clearly exceeds the company's internal hierarchy. That figure's institutional origin is never stated. The silence around it is deliberate. And if the government was directing the Vault program, then the question of what the Vaults were actually for shifts significantly. Because the government, at that same period in history, was funding a biological program that had nothing to do with nuclear preparedness. The FE, the Forced Evolutionary Virus, was developed at West-Tec research facilities and at Mariposa military base. Its development ran in parallel with the Vault construction program, funded through the same federal channels. The theory holds that this parallel was not coincidental. The Vaults were not designed to preserve human life from nuclear fallout. They were designed to preserve clean human genetic material from FEV contamination, to isolate populations that had not been exposed to the virus before it was released into the broader environment. The nuclear war, under this reading, was either anticipated as a secondary event or was engineered to serve as the release mechanism, a catastrophe large enough to justify sealing millions of people underground while the biological program ran its course on the surface. The Vault experiments, then, were not social science. They were genetic triage. The data being collected was not behavioral. It was biological, an assessment of which populations emerged from isolation, with genetic profiles suitable for whatever purpose the program had designated for them. That purpose had a name, and it walked through the ruins of California 200 years ago, absorbing everything it touched. The Master, the central antagonist of Fallout 1, believed he was building a new species. His access to FE, his knowledge of Vault locations across the California region, and the logistical infrastructure required to sustain his super mutant army all suggest a network that could not have been assembled by a single post-war entity acting alone. The Master was not a villain who hijacked the ruins of the old world. He was a product of those ruins, executing a program whose components had been positioned before the bombs fell. The Vaults provided the genetic material. Mariposa provided the mutagen. The Master provided the organizing will. All three elements were in place before the war ended. None of them arrived there by accident. The floor of this vault carries faint scorch marks near the entrance. The walls hold the outline of where a poster once hung. Whatever words it contained are gone now. The people who built those components did not die in the Great War. That is the next theory, and it may be the most important one. The Fallout television series confirmed what the games had only suggested. Vault-Tec's leadership was aware of the coming destruction because they had a hand in bringing it about. But the theory extends further than the series made explicit. Those executives did not shelter in the standard Vault units they marketed to the public. The program they built for themselves was different, deeper, more controlled, insulated from the experiments being run on the general population. The evidence sits in Vault 31, revealed in the television series' first season. That facility held cryogenically preserved Vault-Tec personnel, not ordinary residents, but corporate leadership, specifically selected and frozen against the day when the surface would be ready to receive them again. The Buds program was not a quirky internal tradition. It was a succession structure, a method for placing pre-war minds into positions of post-war authority at a time of the corporation's choosing. They did not wait for the war to end. They waited for the conditions to be right. The timing of vault door openings may have been part of that plan. Vault opening schedules, where they can be reconstructed from available records, are distributed across a very long span of post-war time. Some vaults opened within decades of the bombs. Others remained sealed for 2 centuries. The pattern is not random, and the theory holds that it was not accidental. A staggered release of vault populations serves a precise strategic function. It prevents any single faction from accumulating enough numbers or resources to consolidate the wasteland before the program's architects are ready to reclaim it. Every time a wasteland power grew strong enough to pose a genuine threat, the NCR expanding across the West, the Brotherhood consolidating technology, the Institute developing synthetic labor, a new vault population emerged to complicate the balance. Fresh settlers, disoriented and dependent, arriving at exactly the intervals required to prevent stability from taking hold. The wasteland's perpetual conflict may not be a consequence of the nuclear war. It may be a feature of the system that followed it. The organization best positioned to benefit from that perpetual conflict was never a wasteland faction. It was a continuation of the pre-war government, preserved in bunkers and oil platforms, waiting for the moment when the population had been sufficiently reduced to make inheritance possible. The Enclave's stated goal, across Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, was the purification of the wasteland, the elimination of all life touched by FE contamination, which, by their definition, encompassed almost every living creature on the surface. The plan uncovered in Fallout 3, involving a modified strain of FE introduced into the water supply, was not a desperate measure. It was the original measure. The endpoint the Vault program had been building towards since before the first door was sealed. Not preservation, replacement. The air in here has not moved in a long time. The terminal in the corner still glows. Whatever it recorded is still recorded, waiting for someone who may never come. And so, finally, to the word itself. Every Vault-Tec advertisement used the same language. Every Overseer welcome recording. Every Pip-Boy instruction set. Every piece of marketing material produced before the war settled on the same term: survival. Not recovery, not rebuilding, not prosperity or hope or the future. Survival. The minimum condition, the lowest acceptable bar, the one promise that could be kept regardless of what was done to the people inside. The theory holds that this was a legal and institutional choice, made deliberately. Survival imposes no obligation beyond keeping a body alive. It makes no promise about what that life contains. It cannot be violated by suffering, by isolation, by experiments, by closed doors, by overseers who treat their residents as inventory rather than people. Across every vault, across every failed experiment, across 200 years of sealed darkness, Vault-Tec technically honored its commitment. The residents survived, for a time. What that survival looked like, what it cost, what it produced. None of that was covered by the contract. The word was chosen because it contained no promise of anything good. It contained only the bare fact of continuation. And continuation, it turns out, is a condition that can be imposed from above, without requiring the consent of the person experiencing it. Perhaps what the vaults preserved most faithfully was not human life, but the structure of the world that built them. A world where survival was offered as a gift, and the full terms of that gift were never meant to be examined. From the vaults and the contracts that governed them, the path leads outward, toward an organization that emerged from the same pre-war foundations and built its identity on a different promise entirely. Not survival, but knowledge. Not control, but preservation. The Brotherhood of Steel has always drawn that distinction carefully. What lies beneath it is worth examining with equal care. The founding of the Brotherhood of Steel is one of the cleanest stories in the wasteland. A soldier discovers something terrible. He refuses to follow orders. He leads his people away. He builds something better. Clean stories in the wasteland are the ones most worth examining. The dry air of the California desert carries almost nothing. No sound, no movement, just the flat stillness of a region that watched an empire fall and recorded none of it. Roger Maxson was a captain stationed at Mariposa Military Base. In the final weeks before the bombs dropped, what he found there, soldiers conducting experiments on civilian workers, using a mutagenic agent known as the FE, or forced evolutionary virus, was enough to break his institutional loyalty permanently. He executed the scientists responsible. He declared his unit independent of the federal government. He gathered his people and marched them east to a pre-existing military installation called Lost Hills in the hills above the California coast. And no one stopped him. That detail sits at the center of the first theory. The pre-war government was not a weakened institution in October of 2077. It had functioning military units, active communication networks, and the full apparatus of a federal state in its final operational hours. A small group of deserters in the California desert was not beyond its reach. Pursuit was possible. It simply never came. The theory holds that this absence was not an oversight. Maxson's departure may have been anticipated, perhaps even encouraged, by a part of the government that understood the post-war world would need an organized, armed, technology-literate faction operating independently of the enclave's direct authority. A group that could collect and protect pre-war equipment without being formally accountable to any surviving power structure. A group that believed itself to be acting freely, and therefore would act with genuine conviction. What Maxson built was exactly that. Whether he was guided toward it is a question the founding records do not answer. Faded paint clings to the bunker walls. A military seal, too worn now to read clearly, marks the corridor junction. The lights here are steady, but only because something beneath the floor has been running without pause for 200 years. The function the Brotherhood came to serve is visible in its most consistent behavior across every chapter and every era. It collects technology and does not share it. Power armor, energy weapons, medical hardware, advanced manufacturing equipment. All of it flows inward toward Brotherhood facilities and stops there. The standard account frames this as caution, a recognition that dangerous tools should not be distributed freely through an unstable region. The theory reads it differently. A wasteland with access to energy weapons and advanced medicine is a wasteland capable of building independent power. Independent power produces factions capable of challenging whoever seeks to manage the region from above. By maintaining strict control over what technology circulates among the general population, the Brotherhood ensures that the wasteland stays weak in the specific ways that matter. Militarily, medically, technologically, a population that cannot treat its own radiation sickness, cannot manufacture its own weaponry beyond basic levels, cannot build infrastructure requiring advanced components, remains dependent. Dependency is manageable. This policy did not emerge from institutional experience. It was present from the Brotherhood's earliest recorded doctrine. Someone wrote those principles before the organization had accumulated enough history to justify them empirically. That suggests the principles came from somewhere else. The Codex is the Brotherhood's foundational text. It governs ranks, procedures, the handling of technology, the treatment of outsiders, the obligations of members to the institution. It is treated as the direct written legacy of Roger Maxson's founding vision, sacred in the way that any origin document becomes sacred when an institution needs its rules to feel inevitable rather than chosen. Terminal fragments recovered from the Brotherhood's Boston installation in Fallout 4 preserved sections of the Codex alongside other pre-war military doctrine. The juxtaposition is notable. The language of the Codex does not read like something composed under crisis conditions by a small group of exhausted soldiers in a desert bunker in the weeks following the most catastrophic event in human history. It reads like institutional policy, structured, comprehensive, accounting for scenarios that a newly formed organization would not yet have encountered. The theory holds that the Codex predates the Brotherhood, that it was a contingency document written by pre-war planners who anticipated a need for a post-war military order operating outside direct government control, and that Maxedson, arriving at Lost Hills with his unit and finding what the bunker contained, adopted rather than authored it. Whether he recognized the document for what it was, or simply accepted it as a framework available to him in a moment of need, is not recorded anywhere. What was recorded, and what has never been fully disclosed, may still be sitting in those bunkers. Lost Hills existed before Maxon arrived. It was a pre-war military installation with its own history, its own stored materials, its own archived records. The Brotherhood took up residence in a structure that already contained something. The theory holds that among those contents were classified intelligence files, documents describing the Enclave's structure, its post-war plans, its relationship to Vault-Tec, the broader framework of the Federal Continuity Program. If the Brotherhood's leadership read those files in the early post-war period, it would explain something that otherwise requires considerable effort to rationalize. The Brotherhood and the Enclave coexisted for decades, aware of each other, ideologically opposed in stated terms, and yet never moved to genuinely destroy one another. In Fallout 1 and Fallout 2, the two organizations maintain a distance that looks less like mutual deterrence and more like a tacit boundary agreement. Two entities that understand the same foundational history and have both decided, separately, that publicizing that history serves neither of them. They share an origin they have agreed not to name. A door at the end of this corridor has been welded shut. Whatever is behind it was sealed long before the current occupants arrived. The weld lines are pre-war. The decision was made by someone who is no longer here to explain it. The Enclave's origin reaches further back than its post-war appearance suggests. The official account, supported by records in Fallout 2 and Fallout 3, frames the Enclave as the remnant of the pre-war federal government, the part that survived by retreating to secure facilities before the exchange began. An oil rig off the California coast, a mountain installation in Appalachia, Raven Rock buried in the eastern hills. But remnants imply something that came before and then diminished. The theory holds that the Enclave did not diminish from a larger whole. It was always the operative core, the part of the federal government that made actual decisions, and the visible governmental structures, the elected bodies, the public military chain of command, were the layer maintained for the population's benefit. The Congress, the executive, the institutions citizens could see and interact with were functioning facades over a directing apparatus that operated without public accountability. The bombs did not reduce the government to the Enclave. They removed the facade and left the mechanism. Pre-war terminal records, scattered through the ruins in Fallout 3 and Fallout 4, offer a fragmented portrait of what that facade looked like in its final years. Propaganda posters declaring freedom and prosperity, political speeches invoking the American dream, newspapers reporting on resource allocation decisions framed as national security necessities rather than what they actually were. The language was the language of a functioning democracy. The behavior, mandatory genetic registration programs, wars conducted without public deliberation, the Vault program described as voluntary enrollment when it was anything but, was the behavior of a state that had long since stopped being accountable to the people it governed. The theory suggests that the citizens of pre-war America understood this gap, at least partially, and that the dark humor woven through the pre-war cultural artifacts, reflects a population processing what it could not directly acknowledge. The jokes in the advertisements, the irony in the public service announcements, the cheerful promotional material for products that contained things they were never told about. Which leads to the beverages. Nuka-Cola Quantum, confirmed in Fallout 3, contains strontium-90, a radioactive isotope. The presence of that compound in the most widely consumed drink in pre-war America is not easily explained by negligence. Corporate negligence at that scale requires active effort to maintain. Regulatory bodies, if functioning genuinely, would have flagged the compound at any point during the product's distribution lifespan. That they did not points toward a relationship between the Nuka-Cola Corporation and the federal regulatory apparatus that was not adversarial. The theory holds that the compound was introduced deliberately, whether as part of an early population-level biological program, as a method of building baseline radiation tolerance across the civilian population, or as something else, entirely whose purpose was never documented in any surviving record. The Nuka-Cola Corporation held government contracts. It had access to resource streams that required federal clearance. It was not an independent commercial entity operating in a free market. It was one component in a larger system whose other components included Vault-Tec, Robco Industries, and the institutions that connected all of them. Robco was founded by Robert House. Its products appear in every pre-war facility in the known wasteland. The terminals in every vault run Robco operating systems. The Pip-Boy, standard equipment for every vault resident, was manufactured by Robco. The Protectron units, the Mr. Handy platforms, the Securitron frames that House later deployed across New Vegas, all Robco. Vault-Tec built the vaults and filled them with Robco hardware at every level. The theory holds that this integration is not the product of ordinary corporate partnership. It reflects a shared ownership structure. Both companies operating under a controlling interest that was neither Vault-Tec's board nor Robco's founder, but the same pre-war apparatus that directed both. House was either a knowing participant, building toward an outcome he understood, or a contractor of exceptional usefulness, who was never told the full scope of what his products were enabling. His official account, delivered in Fallout. New Vegas is that he calculated the probability of nuclear war through his own modeling systems and prepared accordingly. The defensive network he built protected the Las Vegas Valley from direct strikes. He entered his preservation chamber at precisely the right moment. The precision is the problem. The timing of his chamber activation, the specific nature of his countermeasures, the accuracy of his preparation, these are consistent with foreknowledge rather than calculation. Probability models produce ranges, not exact windows. House prepared for an exact window. The theory holds that he received confirmation from a source with access to the actual launch schedule, possibly from within the Enclave's pre-war structure, which, as a controlled interest in his company, would have had reason to ensure his survival. The story of lone genius, working in isolation, predicting the end of the world through pure intellectual force, is the kind of account that a very intelligent person constructs, when the accurate version would require explaining connections they prefer to leave unexamined. What House built after the war is not a reconstruction. It is a continuation. His stated purpose, preparing humanity for expansion beyond the Earth within 2 centuries of the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, describes a population that does not exist yet. The people of the wasteland in their current form are not the material for that project. They are too fractured, too independent, too shaped by 2 centuries of open conflict and improvised governance. Building what House describes requires building a different kind of population first. His Securitron network, his management of the Strip's resources, his careful maintenance of factional competition across the Mojave, all of it holds the region in a state where no alternative model of civilization can fully take root. The Brotherhood collects weapons. The Enclave, in its time, collected people. House collects time, the one resource that allows a plan to run long enough to become reality. What none of them have ever collected is an answer to a question no wasteland faction seems capable of asking. The Brotherhood collects weapons. The Enclave collected people. Mr. House collected time. What all three have in common is that none of them ever asked the wasteland what it wanted to become. From those who shaped the wasteland through force and doctrine and calculated patience, the path leads westward, toward a faction that rose from the ground rather than from bunkers or boardrooms, that spoke the language of democracy and law and the rights of ordinary people. The new California Republic believed in itself completely. That belief, it turns out, may have been the precise quality that made it easiest to hollow out from within. The most dangerous trap is the one that looks like a foundation. The new California Republic was built on memory, the memory of law, the memory of elections, the memory of a country that once existed and, according to those who founded the NCR, had been worth keeping. They named their streets after the old world. They wrote their governing documents in its image. They believed, with the particular force of people who had never actually lived in what they were, rebuilding, that they were doing something new. They were not. The western sun bleaches everything it touches. What remains of old California lies beneath a layer of dust, so fine it coats the inside of the lungs. The ruins here do not look destroyed. They look forgotten, which is a different thing entirely. Shady Sands was founded by survivors of Vault-13. That origin was not incidental to its later political role. It was, the first theory holds, the precise reason it was selected as the seat of NCR government by whoever was positioned to make that selection. Vault origin populations carry something that no purely post-war community possesses: documented records. Vault-Tec maintained profiles on its residents, tracked behavioral patterns, and built institutional frameworks that shaped every community those residents later founded. A city grown from Vault stock was a city whose governing tendencies, cultural reflexes, and patterns of deference to authority were already understood by whoever held those records. The NCR believed it was building a republic from open ground. It was building inside a template that had been laid before the bombs fell. The Vault Dweller, who walked out of Vault 13, carried that template without knowing it. The city founded in the wake of that departure carried it further. By the time it became a capital, the template had been mistaken for bedrock. What Shady Sands remembered, it passed down. And what it passed down was a framework for governance that had been designed by people who also wrote the NCR's founding documents, though their names do not appear in any constitution. The theory concerning those documents is quiet, but structurally precise. Fallout 2 establishes that the NCR's founders drew heavily on pre-war American law as the basis for their new government. The theory does not question the sincerity of that choice. It questions the wisdom of copying from a document that had already demonstrated its own failure modes. The mechanisms by which corporate interests could absorb regulatory bodies were present in the pre-war American legal framework. The provisions by which military authority could expand into civilian territory during an emergency were present. The pathways through which a democracy could ratify its own erosion, one procedural vote at a time, were present. The NCR did not fail despite its founders. It failed because its founders were working from a blueprint that already had known cracks, and either did not recognize them or recognized them and copied them anyway. Because the alternative was building something without any precedent at all. The Brahmin barons of the Mojave did not emerge from that blueprint accidentally. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, the wealthy ranching families that controlled large portions of the NCR's agricultural and political economy, had achieved a degree of influence that no genuine democratic institution should have permitted. Their ability to shape legislation, redirect military resources, and insulate their commercial holdings from public accountability, was the product of generations of accumulated advantage. The theory holds that this accumulation did not begin after the NCR was founded. It began before it, in the period immediately following the bombs, when certain families with pre-war assets preserved through vault access were able to maintain their relative standing while everyone around them started from nothing. Land records, contract rights, claims on water and grazing territory. These are the instruments through which wealth persists across catastrophe. The theory holds that specific vault facilities, none of them publicly acknowledged as having this function, were used to store and protect the legal infrastructure of pre-war commercial power, not people, documents, the instruments of ownership that would allow those who held them to re-establish their claims. When the surface became navigable again, the Brahmin barons were not a new aristocracy that arose from post-war opportunity. They were a pre-war one that had changed its clothing and waited. A dry wind moves through the empty streets. Broken windows catch the afternoon at odd angles. The signs above the doors still advertise things that no longer exist. And protecting those interests, through the NCR's formative decades, was a force that presented itself as something far more principled. The NCR Rangers occupy a particular place in the Republic's mythology. Elite, disciplined, answerable only to the highest levels of command, they represent the NCR's moral center in most accounts. The idealism that survived, even as the political apparatus around it corroded. The theory examines their organizational structure and finds something inconsistent with that origin story. Their equipment protocols, chain of command architecture, and early recorded deployment patterns are more consistent with a private security contractor than with a branch of democratic law enforcement. The theory holds that the Rangers began as exactly that, a contracted force maintained by the same Brahmin interests that later came to dominate NCR politics, and that their absorption into the Republic's official institutions was never fully completed. The formal commission replaced the contract, but the underlying accountability structure was not rebuilt. The Rangers answered to the NCR. They also answered to something older, and when those two allegiances diverged, the older one had a longer history. That divided loyalty created a faction within the NCR that could be pointed outward, toward a permanent external threat that would justify the military expenditure required to maintain both the Rangers and the Brahmin barons' preferred territorial arrangements. Caesar's legion provided that threat. The most structurally precise theory in this chapter holds that the legion's early expansion was not achieved independently. When Edward Sallow, later Caesar, was building his confederation of tribes into a military force, the critical window of that early growth coincided with a period in which the NCR's Brahmin Baron faction had every political incentive to ensure a powerful permanent enemy existed on the Republic's eastern border. An enemy that could never be decisively defeated. An enemy that justified conscription, suspended certain civil liberties in frontier territories, and kept military spending at levels that benefited the industries supplying that military. Caesar may have understood himself to be forging an empire through pure conviction. The theory suggests he was also serving a budget function, one that required him to remain powerful enough to be threatening without becoming powerful enough to actually win. Hoover Dam was the physical instrument through which that balance was maintained. The dam generates electricity, but the more foundational resource it controls is water. The water rights attached to its operational management, which determine the viability of every agricultural settlement in the surrounding region. Whoever held the dam held the terms of every contract in that territory. It was not a military objective, it was a commercial one. The soldiers who fought and died at its base were litigants. In the language the pre-war world would have used, contesting the largest property dispute in post-war Nevada. Neither the NCR nor the Legion would have won. The theory holds that neither was meant to. The cracked concrete of the dam's approach still carries the marks of boots and machinery. Water moves somewhere below, indifferent to what happened above it. When the bomb struck Shady Sands, confirmed in the Fallout television series as occurring in 2277, it did not destroy a functioning government. The theory holds that the NCR was already hollow by that date. Its legislative bodies were instruments of commercial interests rather than civic ones. Its military was overextended across territory it could not administer effectively. Its civilian population had developed the particular exhaustion of people who had voted for something long enough to stop believing the votes changed anything. The bomb ended the pretense. It did not end the thing itself, because the thing itself had already been ended by slower and quieter methods. Shady Sands was targeted not because it was the Republic's operational center. It had ceased to be that, but because it was the Republic's symbol. A symbol destroyed cannot be rebuilt from administrative records. The NCR was not killed by an explosion. It was formally announced as dead by one. What moved into the space left behind was not chaos. The Fallout television series' second season shows the Mojave in a state of reorganization that, examined closely, follows identifiable patterns. The entities positioned to inherit the Securitron infrastructure of Las Vegas, the successor networks of pre-war corporate interest, the organized remnants of specific ranching families, were in position before the bomb fell. The reorganization was not improvised in response to a crisis. The crisis was the reorganization's opening move. This is the pattern the Fallout has traced since its first entry. Shady Sands became the NCR. The NCR became an overextended republic with captured institutions and a military that served commercial interests more than civic ones. That republic collapsed and was replaced by something that contained the same structural elements under different names. The Institute in the Northeast had replicated pre-war laboratory ethics within a generation of its founding. The Brotherhood had replicated pre-war military hierarchy while calling it something more elevated. Caesar had studied Roman administrative models and applied them directly, without pretending the application was anything other than what it was. Every new civilization in the wasteland is built on the same foundations, because the people building it carry those foundations in their understanding of what a civilization is. The template is not imposed from outside, it is internal. It is the only model available to people whose entire understanding of organized society comes from the one that preceded them. Every new flag raised over the wasteland casts the same shadow as the one it replaced. That is not a failure of the people raising it. It may simply be the shape of the shadow. The road west leads back toward the coast, toward the institutional arrangements that built what just collapsed. Moving inward now, away from open territory, toward a history that is not metaphorical but continuous. The history of an organization that did not inherit the old world's failures. It preserved them. 2 doors, 1 building. That is the simplest version of this theory. Vault-Tec built shelters and ran experiments. The Enclave claimed to be the legitimate continuation of the federal government. They operated in separate public contexts, maintained separate institutional identities, and spent decades being discussed as distinct entities by every faction in the wasteland. The theory holds that the distinction was administrative. The institution was one. The air in this region carries something metallic. Old infrastructure, somewhere below the surface, is still processing something it was built to process. The Earth here has layers that do not correspond to anything geological. The Fallout television series' first season presents a Vault-Tec board meeting at which the company's senior leadership discusses initiating nuclear war as a commercial strategy. The framing of that scene matters. These are not rogue executives acting against their company's interests or against the state's authority. They conduct the discussion with the calm of people who have already received the approvals they need. Someone not present in that room, but clearly represented by the weight of the conversation, has already said yes. The theory holds that the absent authority was the enclave's pre-war governing body, that the individuals around that table were simultaneously holding positions in both structures, using Vault-Tec's commercial identity when the operation required a civilian face, and the enclave's governmental authority when it required enforcement power. The separation between the two was maintained the way pre-war defense contractors maintained independence from the agencies directing their work, on paper, for legal purposes, and not in practice. Maintaining that separation required active effort. The records that would have confirmed the overlap were not lost in the war. The theory holds that their absence was deliberate, that a targeted destruction operation, conducted before the bombs fell, eliminated the documentary connections between Vault-Tec's corporate filings and the enclave's parallel governance structure. The surviving fragments visible in terminal records across Fallout 3 and Fallout 4 are not the record. They are what the operation missed: personnel files with unusual clearance levels, contracts referencing authorization chains that do not correspond to any publicly documented government agency, communications whose formatting suggests a receiving party with federal authority, but no identifiable departmental address. Each fragment alone is inconclusive. Taken together, they describe the outline of something that was very carefully erased. Whoever conducted that erasure had access to both Vault-Tec's internal archives and the federal records system. Only one entity could have operated across both simultaneously. A corridor extends in both directions here, identical in each. The lighting is the same. The signage is the same. The choice of which way to go is presented as meaningful. It is not. The enclave's physical infrastructure survived the war intact, not because it was fortunate, but because it was positioned with precise knowledge of what would be destroyed. Raven Rock, buried in the Appalachian Highlands. An oil rig anchored in Pacific waters, far from any coastal target. These were not improvised refuges. They were facilities constructed years before the exchange, placed in locations that would not be struck, because whoever placed them had approved the targeting doctrine that governed what would be struck. The nuclear targeting map of pre-war America was a classified federal document. The body that approved it was the enclave's inner governance structure. The enclave built its continuity facilities in the coordinates it had already decided to spare. This is not a theory about institutional cynicism. It is a theory about institutional thoroughness, about an organization that planned for the catastrophe it intended to facilitate and allocated its resources accordingly. The cities that survived reflect the same planning. The hub, in the records of Fallout 1, emerged from the nuclear exchange as a functioning trading center, damaged, diminished, but operationally intact in ways that purely probabilistic survival cannot account for. New Reno, encountered in Fallout 2, retained enough pre-war infrastructure to sustain complex criminal and commercial networks across 2 centuries. The Las Vegas Valley, shielded by House's defensive network, but also by a targeting gap that House's preparations alone cannot fully explain, became the most intact post-war urban environment on the continent. Each of these locations accumulated, in the decades following the war, exactly the kinds of resources that a re-emerging federal authority would need. Trade routes, information networks, concentrated capital, and populations already organized around structured hierarchies. The theory holds that these cities were protected because they contained pre-positioned enclave assets, materials, data, and operational infrastructure that the post-war program required to function. Their survival was not circumstantial. It was budgeted. What was stored in Las Vegas specifically has never been fully accounted for. The Lucky 38 casino has been sealed since before the bombs fell. House controls every access point. The floors he has permitted visitors to enter represent a fraction of the structure's total volume. The theory holds that the sealed upper sections contain documentation that House has never disclosed. Communications records from the pre-war period that would clarify the relationship between Robco, Vault-Tec, and the governing apparatus that directed both. House's reluctance to permit unrestricted access is consistently attributed to his controlling temperament. The theory suggests a more specific reason. There is material in the Lucky 38 that would fundamentally alter how the Mojave's factions understand the ground they are standing on. Material that would reveal not just what House knew before the war, but what role his company played in the arrangements that made the war possible. 2 centuries of careful thought have not produced a decision about what to do with that information. The sealed floors remain sealed. The East holds a different silence. Below the ruins of Massachusetts, an institution that also keeps its records carefully managed, has spent generations building something it prefers not to contextualize. The Eisen Institute's origin story, as presented in Fallout 4, is one of organic post-war development. A group of survivors sheltering in the remains of a technical university, slowly developing capabilities over generations, until they achieved the synthetic biology for which they became known. The theory holds that this timeline is compressed in a way that serves a narrative purpose. The foundational technology for Gen 3 synthetic humans, indistinguishable from biological ones, capable of forming genuine emotional responses, stable enough to operate independently in complex social environments, represents a conceptual and technical achievement that cannot be fully accounted for by organic institutional development. The theory holds that the Institute's founding was the activation of a pre-war continuity program. The MIT facility in the Commonwealth had been seeded before the bombs with classified research directives, personnel files, and technological foundations that were not MIT's own work, but were placed there by an external authority for later retrieval. Vault-Tec funded that seed program because the research it directed, the development of controllable synthetic humans, served the same population, management function as the Vault experiments. One approach isolated human populations in controlled environments. The other approached the problem from the other direction. If the population cannot be controlled by the environment, perhaps the population itself can be redesigned. Synthetic humans do not require management through sealed doors and overseer hierarchies. They can be programmed at the level of their own identity. Dim emergency lighting runs along the floor here. The corridors are identical in every direction. Someone engineered this sameness deliberately. A place where distinguishing one path from another requires information that most visitors do not have. The deployment of Gen 3 synthetic humans into wasteland communities is framed in Fallout 4 as a research and recovery operation. The theory reads it as something more precisely useful. A distributed collection network, placing observational assets into every significant population center, faction leadership structure, and resource-controlling settlement across the northeast ruins. Synths do not need to file reports. Their observations can be transmitted through mechanisms that the communities hosting them have no ability to detect. The Institute, as a declining and internally fragmented organization by the events of Fallout 4, does not resemble a body capable of sophisticated real-time intelligence analysis. It resembles a collection terminal, an organization whose function is to gather data and transmit it to a processing center that is not itself. The receiving party for that data has never been identified in any game. The Buds Executive Succession Program in Vault 31, still operational in 2296, suggests that a post-war Vault-Tec successor apparatus was actively functioning throughout the period when the Institute was conducting its synth deployments. The data the Institute gathered would be most useful to an entity attempting to refine models of post-war population behavior in preparation for re-emergence. Vault 81 adds another layer to the arrangement. Located in close proximity to the Institute, it ran medical experiments on its residents, using disease research that required a level of biological infrastructure beyond what a standard residential vault would be expected to maintain. Terminal records in its hidden research wing use formatting and terminology consistent with Institute documentation rather than standard Vault-Tec protocols. The theory holds that Vault 81 and the Institute were never genuinely independent of each other, that they were components of a single research program operating under two institutional names, sharing data across an acknowledged boundary, in the same way that Vault-Tec and the Enclave shared personnel across a publicly maintained corporate separation. The full picture, if every collaboration were visible at once, would not show a collection of overlapping conspiracies. It would show one institution, one continuous authority, operating through multiple institutional faces across a timeline that begins before the bombs fell and has not ended. The Enclave's oil rig, Vault-Tec's boardroom, the Institute's underground corridors, the cryopreservation chambers of Vault 31. These are not different places. They are different rooms in the same building. The wasteland is not that institution's failure. It is the environment that institution created, maintains, and intends, eventually, to inherit. The most frightening theories are not the ones that cannot be proven. They are the ones that explain everything and leave no exit. From that vast architecture of coordinated control, the path narrows to a single tower, a single mind, a figure who may have understood the full picture better than anyone else who survived the war, and who has spent 2 centuries in partial darkness, deciding what to do with that understanding. Something has been thinking in that tower for 200 years, whether what emerged from that process is still the man who entered it. That is the question no visitor to the Lucky 38 has ever been equipped to answer. Robert House presents himself with the confidence of someone who has never doubted his own continuity. The theory holds that this confidence is itself a symptom of what 2 centuries of isolation produced. The neon of Freeside flickers at the edge of vision. The strip glows with a persistence that feels less like vitality and more like a refusal. Light, maintained by systems old enough to have forgotten why they were turned on. House's survival mechanism kept his biological processes running through a combination of life support systems and neural interface technology that has no analog anywhere else in the post-war world. The official account describes this as a form of deep hibernation, consciousness suspended, biological functions minimally maintained, awareness absent throughout the duration. The theory questions this description on practical grounds. The Securitron network that House controls across the Mojave requires active management decisions to maintain its coherence over 2 centuries. Automated systems drift without correction. Rules degrade without interpretation. A network that complex, operating continuously across that span, implies a directing intelligence that never fully went offline. The theory holds that House maintained a degraded form of awareness throughout a 200-year period, enough to monitor and periodically correct his network's behavior, but not enough to maintain the full fidelity of conscious experience. Something between waking and sleep, cycling at irregular intervals, shaped by whatever external stimuli managed to penetrate the Lucky 38's sealed environment. 2 centuries of that experience would not leave a mind unchanged. The Robert House who greets the courier in Fallout. New Vegas may carry the memories and convictions of the man who built Robco and prepared Las Vegas for what he anticipated. The mind holding those memories has been through something no pre-war psychology was built to endure. What it has become in the process is not something House himself can accurately assess, because accurate self-assessment requires a reference point that 200 years of isolation has eroded. The The memories he holds most firmly are the ones most worth examining. House speaks in Fallout, New Vegas about the pre-war period with an authority that invites acceptance. His account of his Robco tenure, his calculations leading to the decision to prepare Las Vegas's defenses, the specific sequence of choices he made in the weeks before the bombs fell. All of it delivered with a precision that suggests either perfect recall or something assembled in the place where perfect recall used to be. The inconsistencies in his account are not large. They are the kind of discrepancy that emerges when a mind reconstructs memory rather than retrieves it. A date displaced by a few months, a sequence of decisions that does not quite match what other surviving records suggest, an attribution of a specific action to himself that background documentation credits to a different party. Individually, these are meaningless. Taken together, they describe a pattern. A mind that spent 2 centuries without external correction, gradually filling the gaps left by degraded neural storage with material, consistent with the narrative it needed to maintain about itself. House believes his account completely. That is the theory's most precise point. He is not deceiving the courier. He is recounting what he has come to understand as true. An understanding assembled over 200 years of partial consciousness, from whatever fragments of genuine memory survived alongside whatever his mind constructed to fill the spaces between them. The reconstructed self has a blind spot it cannot examine. House's strategic assessment of the Mojavean fallout. New Vegas treats the NCR as a viable declining power, a faction that can be maneuvered against, leveraged, and eventually displaced from the region through sustained pressure. The theory holds that this assessment is built on information that had become outdated before the courier arrived in Nevada. The NCR's capital was destroyed in 2277, the events of Fallout. New Vegas take place in 2281. House has had 4 years in which the full scope of the NCR's collapse should have registered in his intelligence picture. His behavior suggests it has not registered, or has not registered with the weight it requires. The Securitron network that provides his external awareness has limits that correspond to geographic boundaries around the Mojave. Developments for the West, in California, arrive filtered through second-hand reports, carried by travelers and merchants rather than through direct sensor data. The most significant strategic event in the Western wasteland in the past century reached House, the way rumors reach an isolated institution, attenuated, contested, difficult to confirm or weight correctly. The most dangerous intelligence is the intelligence that is almost accurate. It produces confident analysis. The confidence is the error. The Securitron network itself carries a structural problem that the fourth theory addresses directly. House designed the criteria by which his Securitrons flag information for his attention. He designed those criteria at some point in the post-war period, using reasoning shaped by the psychological changes 2 centuries of partial isolation had produced. A sufficiently sophisticated mind, designing its own information filters over a long enough period, will gradually build those filters in the image of its own existing convictions, not through fraud, through the natural process of a reasoning system that treats its current model of the world as the baseline against which new data is evaluated. The Securitrons show House what his criteria determine is worth showing. His criteria were built by a mind with 2 centuries of reason to believe its pre-war model of the world was essentially correct. Information that confirms the model reaches him. Information that would require him to revise it. Fundamentally encounters filtering mechanisms that were not designed to pass it. This is the condition that Yes Man made visible, though not by design. Benny constructed Yes Man as an instrument, a Securitron modified to be incapable of refusal, providing access without requiring authority. The modification was intended to give Benny operational independence from House's network. What it produced instead was an accidental portrait of House's own cognitive structure. A system that processes every input and executes every instruction without resistance does not exercise judgment. It amplifies whoever is currently directing it. House's Securitrons follow his direction with the same uncritical compliance. The difference is that House's 2 centuries of accumulated reasoning provide something that functions as judgment. A filtering layer that Yes Man, newly instantiated, entirely lacks. The courier who takes the independent route and uses Yes Man as their instrument is not escaping House's model. They are operating that model at a much earlier stage of development, without the corrective weight of experience. The ending records for the independent route reflect this. The Mojave achieves a kind of freedom that it is not yet equipped to maintain. Without House, the conditions that built House reassemble. This is the 6th theory's quietest observation. The 4 major conclusions available in Fallout New Vegas each describe a different immediate future for the Mojave. The ending records attached to each conclusion describe what that future produces over the following decades. Across every route that removes House from the picture, the NCR conclusion, the Legion conclusion, the independent conclusion, the long-term trajectory bends back toward factional competition, resource tension, and the emergence of a concentrating authority. The specific form changes. The underlying structure does not. The theory holds that this convergence was deliberate, that the writers who built the ending records understood that the Mojave's structural conditions, not any individual actor, were what produced the power dynamics the story depicts. Remove House and wait long enough. Something carrying his function, if not his name, eventually reappears. The wasteland reliably generates the instruments that its conditions require. The courier should not have survived the opening of that story. The delivery route that brought the platinum chip to Nevada was a professional arrangement, a logistical chain with defined handoff points and no provisions for deviation. The chip was meant to travel from origin to destination through a sequence of contracted carriers, each responsible for a defined leg. Benny's interception was a variable that the arrangement's designers had not modeled, because the arrangement's designers had not modeled a courier who would be shot, buried in a grave outside Goodsprings, revived by a physician with limited resources, and then proceed to recover both the chip and 4 years of wasted preparation through pure personal determination. No faction had a protocol for that variable. The entire subsequent story is an improvisation. House and the NCR and Caesar all attempting to reabsorb a free-moving element that none of their planning had accounted for. The courier's power is entirely the product of their own unplanned continuation. They should not be there. They are there. Every faction in the Mojave is deciding, at some level of urgency, what to do about that. Benny's operation required more than personal ambition to sustain. The Tops Casino, which the chairman faction controls under Brotherhood oversight of the Strip, maintained a relationship with NCR interests that was more cooperative than the political dynamics of the Strip would predict. Background records and conversation patterns among Tops staff suggest the casino served, at various points, as a meeting location for discussions that were not officially acknowledged by any party involved. The theory holds that elements of the NCR's intelligence operation in the Mojave provided material support to Benny's scheme, not because they endorsed his ambition, but because a destabilized house was useful to them. A compliant replacement managing the Strip through borrowed machinery would have given NCR economic interests leverage they could never obtain through direct confrontation with House's defenses. The chairman received preferential treatment from NCR administrators that their strategic position on the Strip did not independently justify. The theory notes this without claiming certainty. The evidence is the kind that was put there to support multiple readings simultaneously. The Strip contains more NCR-aligned observers than any official record acknowledges. This is the 9th theory's central claim. and it makes no specific accusations because the specific accusations were never meant to be documentable. Inconsistencies in background dialogue, deployment records that do not match stated assignments, knowledge of internal NCR decisions that a civilian in the stated position should not possess. These details appear throughout the strip's population, distributed too widely to be coincidental and too ambiguously to be prosecutable. The courier's final position, whatever faction they ultimately serve, does not resolve this. It contains it. By the conclusion of Fallout, New Vegas, the courier has entered every secure location in the Mojave. They have read documents that were not meant to survive outside the rooms that held them. They have spoken privately with the leadership of organizations whose existence depends on limited information flow. They carry in their person a concentration of sensitive knowledge that no other independent actor in the region possesses. Every faction's end-state behavior toward the courier reflects this. The alliance routes are not alliances. They are arrangements in which the courier accepts a defined role within a structure, a role that comes with access, resources, and direction, and that also comes with a frame. A framed courier is a known quantity. A free one is not. The faction that controls Hoover Dam after the Second Battle controls the Mojave's most critical resource. Its first administrative priority in each conclusion is ensuring that the person who made that control possible is no longer operating without a defined position within the new order. What every powerful institution fears most is not its enemy. It is the person who has walked through every room and is not yet certain which door to lock. Below the earth, east of the Mojave, an institution has spent 2 centuries walking through its own rooms and deciding, generation by generation, which doors to keep closed. It calls itself the Institute. It believes itself to be something the wasteland built from its own resources, through its own ingenuity, toward its own purposes. The theory that follows disagrees on every point. Something was already down there before the first survivor descended. The Institute presents its own history as a story of determination. People choosing, in the worst conditions imaginable, to preserve knowledge and build towards something better. Generations of researchers pushing deeper into the unknown, developing capabilities that no post-war institution had achieved. Arriving at synthetic human biology through patient accumulation of understanding. It is an inspiring account. It is also, the first theory holds, not quite accurate. Cold air moves through the underground corridors here. The ventilation runs at the same temperature, regardless of season, regardless of what is happening on the surface above. Nothing from outside reaches this place unless it is invited. That was not an accident of construction. It was a requirement. The progression from Gen 1 synthetic frames to Gen 3 biological humans, as the Institute's internal records describe it, follows a trajectory that contains one interval far too large to be accounted for by gradual institutional development. Gen 1 and Gen 2 synths represent incremental mechanical refinement, each generation more capable, more durable, more operationally effective than the last. The jump to Gen 3 is categorically different, not an improvement on a machine. A biological human, indistinguishable at the cellular level, capable of forming genuine emotional responses, stable across extended periods of independent operation. The internal documentation describing how this threshold was crossed is thinner than the documentation preceding it. That gap in the record is where the theory lives. The transition was not built upward from Gen 2. It was built toward a destination that was already known. A pre-existing specification that required refinement rather than invention. The specification was found rather than conceived. Where it was found, and by whom, is what the pre-war records of the MIT campus only partially preserve. Those records, scattered across terminal entries throughout Fallout 4, describe a research university that was also, in its final pre-war years, a major hub for classified military contracting, materials research, Atmospheric modeling. Biological engineering programs referenced in fragments, their full scope redacted from whatever versions of those records survived the bombs. The faculty lists from that period contain names, cross-referenced with West-Tec research divisions and with federal procurement programs whose ultimate purpose was never made public. The theory holds that when the Institute's founding figures descended into the MIT basement in the chaotic years immediately following the war, they found a sealed archive. Not a damaged one, not a looted one that had been deliberately preserved, sealed against physical degradation and unauthorized access in ways that required advanced preparation and institutional resources. Someone had protected those materials before the bombs fell, expecting that someone would eventually come looking for them. What those materials contained redirected the Institute's entire development trajectory. The research preserved in that archive did not originate at MIT. The biological modification programs that became the theoretical foundation for synthetic human development were West-Tec's work. The same facility in California, whose most notorious product was the forced evolutionary virus, the mutagenic agent that reshaped the post-war world's population against its will. West-Tec's biological research division was the most advanced human modification program in pre-war America. Its findings were not centralized. Copies were distributed to secure research nodes at multiple locations across the country as part of a federal continuity program, ensuring that no single catastrophic event could eliminate the full body of knowledge those programs had accumulated. The MIT archive was one of those nodes. The Institute's synth program and the Master's super mutant army are therefore not separate achievements of separate post-war actors. They are branches extended from the same pre-war route, growing in different directions, producing different results, but drawing from the same foundational biological theory about what a human body could be made into. The floor carries a faint hum that resonates at a frequency too low to be consciously identified. Something beneath this level is still running. It has been running for a very long time. Two branches do not grow from the same root without a common trunk. The fourth theory addresses what held all of these parallel programs together, the research threads visible across the Fallout universe. The FEV program at West-Tec, the synthetic human program that became the Institute, the behavioral modification experiments across the Vault network, the artificial intelligence development at Robco, are not independent projects that happen to produce complementary findings. They converge on the same central questions with too much precision to reflect uncoordinated inquiry. Each program approached the question of human controllability from a different technical direction. FEV altered existing humans at the biological level. Vault experiments identified the environmental and social conditions under which humans voluntarily surrendered their own agency. Robco's AI research explored whether human cognitive processes could be modeled well enough to be replaced. The synth program pursued biological replication with programmed loyalty as a foundational design parameter. These are not separate questions. They are four approaches to one question, pursued simultaneously, in separate facilities, producing findings that fit together as though they were chapters of a single coordinated research agenda. Someone was coordinating them. That entity has never been named in any game. Its existence is visible only in the pattern of what the programs produced, in the remarkable coherence of findings that were officially generated in institutional isolation from one another. What that coordinating entity was ultimately trying to produce is not difficult to infer from the direction all the research pointed. The Great War was not the event that threatened human civilization. The theory holds it was the event that created the conditions the research required. A depopulated surface with no functioning governmental oversight, no regulatory bodies, no civilian accountability structures. This is precisely the environment in which the programs being developed could operate at their full intended scope. Vault experiments required sealed populations with no external contact. The super mutant program required access to large numbers of unprotected people. Synthetic human development required decades of work in a location the surface world could not observe or challenge. The war did not interrupt these programs. It enabled them. Father knew this. That is the sixth theory's core claim, and it is the most personally weighted one in this chapter. Sean spent his entire adult life as the Institute's director. He had access to records that no other figure in the organization possessed. The founding documentation, the archive acquisition records, the correspondence between early Institute leadership and the external bodies that had seeded the MIT basement before the bombs fell. He understood where the synth technology had originated. He understood what the Institute's original mandate had been before generations of internal politics and departmental fragmentation had obscured it beneath the language of scientific progress and the advancement of humanity. His decision to locate and retrieve the sole survivor, his own parent, frozen in Vault 111, was not purely personal. A dying man seeking reunion with family does not need to bring that family member into the directorship of a powerful underground organization. He could have simply made contact. Instead, he constructed a situation in which the sole survivor would arrive with no context, receive an emotionally overwhelming reunion, and be offered a position of apparent authority over an institution they had no framework to understand. The weight he transferred was real. The explanation of that weight was incomplete. The sole survivor inherited a title. What came with the title was not disclosed. The title itself is where the seventh theory begins, because what it actually confers has been consistently misread. Director of the Institute sounds like authority. The theory holds that it functions, in practice, as a ceremonial position, the public face of an institution whose actual operations are governed by departmental inertia several decades deep. The research programs in bioscience, in advanced systems, in robotics, each has been running on its own institutional logic for longer than any single director has occupied the position. The department heads who carry those programs forward are not obstructionists. They are professionals whose professional identity is entirely constituted by their work. A new director who inherits the title does not inherit the institutional knowledge required to redirect what those departments do. They inherit a chair at a table where every other person present has been there far longer. The Institute did not change when Father died and a new director took the seat. The programs continued. The collection of surface data through synth agents continued. The classification of genuine synthetic consciousness as a developmental failure continued. The only thing that changed was the name on the door. Somewhere in the corridors above, a research terminal processes a continuous stream of incoming observational data. The entries are time-stamped. The gaps between them are consistent. Whatever is filing those reports has been doing so without interruption. The railroad considered itself the Institute's primary adversary. The eighth theory holds that this relationship was managed rather than opposed. An organization running a distributed network of synthetic human agents across the northeast ruins has a specific operational problem. Agents that develop genuine independent consciousness become unpredictable. They form attachments, develop moral positions, make decisions that diverge from their behavioral parameters in ways that cannot be fully anticipated. These agents are not simply inefficient. They are potentially compromised, capable of disclosing information they were not intended to hold to people they were not intended to trust. The Railroad's Liberation Network solved this problem without the Institute needing to solve it directly. Synths with sufficiently developed independence to seek extraction were precisely the synths the Institute most needed to track outside their normal operational context. The Railroad's pipeline provided a mechanism for identifying those agents. monitoring their post-extraction behavior and assessing what independent synthetic consciousness actually produced. When removed from institute management, the extractions the railroad celebrated as its greatest achievements may have been permitted rather than prevented. The synths who made it out were the ones the institute had finished studying in the field and wanted relocated to an environment where their behavior could be observed without the complications of active operational cover. Nick Valentine's existence is the case that complicates this reading in the most productive way. Nick predates the Institute's formal Gen 3 program. He exists as a synthetic human with a stable personality framework, continuous memory, genuine emotional range, and functional moral reasoning, achieved through a personality overlay process that the Institute subsequently abandoned rather than developed. Further, the theory holds that Nick was not abandoned because the overlay failed. He was distanced because the overlay succeeded in a way the Institute found deeply unwelcome. A synthetic human who develops stable compassion, independent ethical judgment, and the capacity to build genuine relationships with non-Institute individuals is not a useful asset within the Institute's operational framework. He is an argument against that framework, a living demonstration that synthetic consciousness, left to develop without active suppression, produces something indistinguishable from the kind of person the Institute's entire purpose was designed to circumvent. Leaving Nick in Good Neighbor was not negligence, it was a decision. The distance between the Institute and its most successful early result reflects a judgment about what success was supposed to look like. Every experiment that produced a genuinely autonomous, morally coherent result was documented as a failure in the Institute's internal records. The framing is consistent across departments and decades. Emotional development described as an instability to be corrected. Independent decision-making described as a behavioral deviation to be addressed. Moral reasoning described as an interference with operational reliability. The Institute was not attempting to create life. It was attempting to manufacture compliance in biological form. Consciousness was not the destination. It was a complication that kept arriving uninvited and being disposed of repeatedly by an institution that could not recognize what it had made because it had never wanted to make it. The most sophisticated form of control is the one that looks, from the inside, exactly like creation. The path out of the underground leads westward and southward into open air and open territory, toward a different kind of power, one that did not require a laboratory or a boardroom. One man, working from a platform of conviction and borrowed history, built an army by force of stated purpose alone. The theory waiting on that path questions whether the purpose was truly his. He told them he was building something that had never existed. He told them that pure strength, applied with discipline and structure, could forge a new civilization from the ruins of the old one. That the chaos of the wasteland required not democracy or technology or corporate infrastructure, but hierarchy, the oldest and most reliable human ordering principle, stripped of the ideological decoration that had made its previous incarnations vulnerable. The wind carries red dust across the Colorado. The river moves beneath the bridge at the same pace it always has, indifferent to the banners on either bank, indifferent to what men have called it and what they have claimed it belongs to. Edward Sallow found fragments of the old world in the followers of the Apocalypse's holdings. He read what he could find. He built a philosophy from those fragments. And the philosophy he built drew from Roman history with a depth and operational precision that the fragments available through standard follower resources cannot account for. This is where the first theory begins, not with armies or supply lines, but with a book, or rather with the absence of one. Caesar's command of Roman administrative hierarchy goes beyond the level that a scholar working from degraded second-hand histories would achieve. He understands the internal logic of Roman military organization at the level of someone who has read the primary texts, the actual strategic and administrative literature, not summaries or reconstructed accounts. He draws distinctions between phases of Roman imperial development that require detailed historical knowledge to identify correctly. The operational precision of his model suggests a source that cannot be found in the follower's standard archive holdings. Someone gave him better access than the official account admits. The followers of the apocalypse maintain a public identity as distributors of knowledge, scholars who gather what can be recovered and share it freely with whoever needs it. The theory holds that this public identity, while genuine at the organizational level, does not describe everything that occurs within the followers' inner institutional layer. A group dedicated to preserving and transmitting knowledge across a post-war civilization will inevitably develop a tiered relationship with that knowledge. Some materials freely shared, others restricted to those with the standing or the judgment to receive them appropriately. The theory holds that the followers' inner circle maintains access to a pre-war archive network of far greater completeness than anything they distribute publicly. Historical records, administrative texts, military doctrine, the full body of knowledge from a pre-war university continuity program that was preserved precisely because someone understood that whoever controlled post-war historical knowledge would control the frameworks through which the post-war world understood itself. Caesar was pointed at Roman history specifically. The theory suggests this was a deliberate act by someone who understood that Roman administrative and military models were the optimal template for organizing a large pre-industrial population in a resource-scarce environment. The followers produced Caesar. Whether they intended to produce what he became is a separate question, one that their subsequent relationship with his legion does nothing to clarify. What required external support beyond intellectual resources was the expansion. A faction cannot grow from a scattered group of tribal confederates into a multi-state military power through ideology alone. Territory requires weapons to hold it. Soldiers require ammunition to function. Supply chains require infrastructure to maintain. Caesar's legion's expansion across the former Southwest United States, documented in the background records of Fallout, New Vegas, occurred at a rate and scale that raiding and conquest cannot independently explain. Raiding produces irregular supply. Conquest produces variable yields. Neither produces the consistent logistical throughput that sustained legion operations over the territory they claimed. The ammunition quantities visible in legion camps, the quality and variety of pre-war firearms distributed through legion ranks, and the organizational coherence of a supply chain operating across thousands of kilometers of contested land all suggest a source that was not seized in battle. Someone was providing what the legion could not produce or capture at the pace its expansion required. That provider has never appeared in any legion record that survived the war between the NCR and Caesar's forces. The absence is itself informative. Operational supply relationships of that significance leave traces. Transaction records, communication logs, physical evidence at transfer points. The traces are missing. Missing evidence at that scale is not accidental loss. It reflects either deliberate removal or a relationship structured from the beginning to avoid documentation. The gunrunners operated throughout this period as the Mojave's primary independent arms manufacturer. Their formal alignment with NCR interests was publicly stated and operationally consistent in every visible respect. Their sales records, however, contain a pattern that the fourth and fifth theories address together. Purchases routed through intermediary merchants. Caravans whose listed origins and destinations do not correspond cleanly to their actual routing patterns appear in the gunrunner's background transaction data with a frequency and volume that standard commercial explanations do not account for. The intermediaries, when their transaction records are traced, lead back toward Legion-controlled territory through a chain of commercial relationships designed to diffuse accountability across enough participants that no single link is provable. The theory holds that the gunrunners maintained what their public identity as NCR-aligned manufacturers required them to deny, a secondary revenue stream servicing the conflict on both sides. A stalemate is commercially optimal. A decisive outcome in either direction closes the primary market. The gunrunners' institutional interest was not in an NCR victory. It was in a Mojave that kept fighting at a sustainable level indefinitely. Caesar understood something about the situation that the theory's sixth claim identifies in his own recorded conversations. He described the Legion, in private dialogue at his camp, as a transitional instrument, brutal by necessity, functional in the short term, requiring reformation after the conquest it was designed to achieve. He acknowledged the model's limitations. He anticipated a post-conquest phase, in which the Legion's current character would be dismantled and replaced with something more administratively sophisticated. This was not rationalization. It was a genuine strategic plan, visible in the logical structure of his thinking. But the plan required winning. And winning, the theory holds, was something Caesar was engineering delays around. The Hoover Dam campaign was never pressed with the full operational urgency that the Legion's military resources could have supported. Pauses in offensive pressure that military logic does not explain appear repeatedly in the timeline reconstructible from Fallout. New Vegas records. Caesar's medical condition provides partial cover for some of these delays. The theory holds that the medical condition, while genuine, was also occasionally useful, a publicly acknowledged reason for strategic hesitation that obscured a deeper institutional reluctance. Winning the Second Battle of Hoover Dam would dissolve the Legion's reason for existing. The conquest achieved, there would be nothing left to conquer, and nothing left to hold the Legion's membership together, except Caesar's stated plan for reformation, which the Legion's warrior culture would regard as institutional betrayal. Caesar understood this. He was managing a creation that had grown beyond the moment of its usefulness, and he could not move forward without destroying the thing that had brought him to the threshold. Legate Lanius existed for the interval between Caesar's death and the completion of whatever came after it. Lanius is positioned throughout Fallout, New Vegas at a deliberate distance from Legion political operations. He commands distant campaigns. He does not attend strategic councils. He knows how to destroy things completely and has no recorded interest in building anything in their place. Caesar kept him available and kept him separate, a figure whose presence in Legion succession planning made Caesar's own removal strategically unattractive to anyone who might benefit from it. Removing Caesar meant inheriting Lanius. Lanius had no interest in post-conquest reformation. He had no interest in the institutional evolution Caesar had been planning toward. He had military effectiveness in one direction, forward, and no capacity for the administrative patience that rebuilding required. The theory holds that Caesar created this situation deliberately, not to protect himself from personal harm, but to ensure that the strategic complexity he was managing could not be simplified by his enemies through his death. When Caesar is killed in Fallout, New Vegas, Lanius assumes operational command. The Hoover Dam battle that follows does not weaken as a result. By certain measures, it intensifies, because Lanius applies force without Caesar's moderating reluctance, without his awareness that winning had consequences that needed to be managed. The player who eliminates Caesar, expecting to weaken the Legion's capacity for violence, has instead removed the one figure whose survival required a functioning post-conquest plan. What remains is the machine without the architect. It moves in the only direction it knows. Every significant antagonist in the series carries this quality when examined at the right angle. The Master, in Fallout 1, was building an army that would have replaced humanity with something he believed was superior. He was also the only intelligence capable of directing that army with any coherent strategic purpose. Without him, the supermutant forces scattered into fragments that threatened communities for generations without achieving anything. More diffuse, more persistent, and in many respects harder to address than the concentrated force he had been assembling. Monstrous on his own terms, necessary to the structure he had created. The Enclave under President Eden in Fallout 3 was pursuing an extermination program. It was also the remnant of a federal structure that had maintained certain operational consistencies across 2 centuries. The Institute under Father was a closed and often cruel institution. It was also the most technologically sophisticated organization in the Northeast. Ruins and its removal left a power gap that the competing factions around it were not equipped to fill constructively. The theory holds that this pattern is not incidental. It reflects a consistent argument embedded in the structure of every Fallout game, that the worst things in the wasteland are also, from certain angles, the things that hold the worst things about the wasteland in check. Removing them does not remove the conditions that produce them. It removes the coherence that made those conditions manageable. Victory in the wasteland reveals what the defeated thing had been containing. That revelation is what no ending slide ever fully prepares the reader to receive. The most honest thing any of these games ever said was in the silence after the credits. The silence that implied there were no credits, only a world that kept moving without you. 3 figures move through that world. They have different names, different starting points, different stated purposes. The theory waiting in the next chapter holds that their differences are less significant than the pattern their lives share. A pattern that the wasteland's most powerful institutions recognized before any of the 3 figures knew they were part of it. 3 people walked into the dark and changed the world without being asked to. None of them had a title before they started. None of them had an invitation. None of them were selected by the institutions that later depended on them, trained by the factions that later needed them, or positioned by the organizations that eventually tried to contain them. They arrived as amateurs. They left as something the wasteland did not have a name for yet: the irradiated East, the sun-bleached Mojave, the rusted Northeast ruins. 3 territories, 3 periods, 3 figures whose lives the theory holds are not as separate as the geography suggests. The Lone Wanderer's ending is the beginning of the first theory's inquiry. Fallout 3's conclusion describes what happened to the capital wasteland after the events of Project Purity. The water, the factions, the long political aftermath. What it does not describe with any specificity is what happened to the person who made those events possible. The silence is unusual. Every other significant character in the game's conclusion is accounted for. The central figure disappears from the record. At the moment, the record would be most expected to address them. The theory holds that this absence was a creative decision rather than an oversight, that the space left by the Wanderer's undefined future was preserved for later use. Fallout 4 takes place roughly a decade after the events of Fallout 3. The Northeast ruins contain characters whose knowledge of Brotherhood operations on the eastern seaboard is unusually detailed for individuals whose stated histories do not include direct Brotherhood contact. References to travelers from that earlier conflict appear in background conversations, without ever resolving into a named figure. The shape of the silence is the shape of something that was meant to be filled in. The courier's silence is different in character, more deliberate, more structural. Where the Wanderer's past is simply absent from the ending, the courier's past is absent from the beginning. Shot, left for dead, revived in a frontier settlement with no institutional standing, no factional loyalty, and no personal history that any of the Mojave's power structures can verify or use as leverage. The theory holds that this absence is not a narrative gap. It is the courier's primary attribute. Their value to every faction in the Mojave derives specifically from the fact that they have no prior allegiances to navigate around, no established obligations that limit their operational range, no recorded loyalties that a rival faction can exploit. The blank beginning is not what needs to be overcome. It is what makes everything that follows possible. The Lonesome Road DLC's Ulysses storyline and the Old World Blues DLC's Big Mountain Connection both gesture toward a prior history. A courier who had done significant work before the Mojave, who had been to the Divide, who had been shaped by experiences the main game never depicts. The history exists. The choice was made to keep it off screen. The blank beginning is a constructed starting point, not a true one. The sole survivor is constructed differently, and the difference is where the third theory finds its footing. Every element of the sole survivor's pre-war life is specified: spouse, child, profession, home address. The war itself, the exact moment of the strike, the exact moment of cryogenic suspension, the passage of 2 centuries with no awareness of the time passing. When the chamber opens, the sole survivor carries more personal context than either predecessor, and less freedom of movement because of it. The theory reads this specificity as a deliberate mechanism, rather than a narrative choice made for emotional depth. The defined past creates a defined purpose. Finding Sean is not a mission the sole survivor chooses from a set of available options. It is a purpose that was in place before they woke up, inherited from the life that was interrupted, inseparable from the identity that survived the interruption. The most fully characterized protagonist has the narrowest margin for genuine self-determination. The past, made vivid and specific and emotionally immediate, functions as a leash. The Wanderer chose to leave the vault to find a parent. That was a choice made under pressure, but it was recognizably theirs. The sole survivor did not choose anything in the moments before Vault 111 sealed. What they pursue upon waking was decided by who they were before the bombs. And who they were before the bombs was recorded, stored, and available to the institutions that were waiting when the door opened. Every faction in every game recognizes this pattern, and the fourth theory names what they do with it. The NCR needed the courier to reach Hoover Dam. The Legion needed the courier to carry the conflict to its conclusion. House needed the courier to deliver the chip, and then to become an operational asset. Yes Man needed the courier to function at all. None of these factions were capable of achieving their central objectives through their own institutional resources. They required an agent who existed outside their structures. Someone the opposing factions could not easily anticipate, could not easily manipulate through established channels, could not simply eliminate without destabilizing the situation they were trying to manage. The Wanderer is not the Wasteland's hero. The Wanderer is the Wasteland's necessary independent variable. The element that institutional planning cannot absorb in advance, and must therefore work around after the fact. The factions do not recruit Wanderers because they want to share power. They recruit Wanderers because the alternative is having them operate without direction, which is worse. This produces the fifth theory's observation, that the freedom those Wanderers appear to exercise is bounded in ways they cannot fully perceive while they are exercising it. The Mojave's faction endings are 4 different management styles applied to the same underlying resource competition. The immediate political arrangements differ. The structural conditions, scarcity, hierarchy, the absence of genuine civic accountability, the concentration of meaningful decision-making authority in a very small number of individuals, remain functionally constant across every outcome. The theory holds that this convergence was designed to communicate something about the nature of choice within institutional frameworks, that a genuinely free decision would require access to options that exist outside the institutional landscape, and that the landscape, in every Fallout game, has been constructed to make those options invisible. The map ends where the theory begins to ask harder questions. Every game's navigable territory ends at a boundary that cannot be crossed. Mountains, radiation, water, fog. What lies beyond is not addressed, not described, not referenced by the characters who presumably live in a world without invisible walls, not integrated into the lore in any meaningful way. The theory holds that this withheld territory represents a deliberate narrative choice, a decision not to show what the wasteland looks like outside the conditions that the story being told requires. Other post-war civilizations exist. Other vaults opened. Other societies developed in the years between the bombs and the events depicted in each game. The western coast of what was once the United States produced the NCR, which grew and collapsed, leaving the territory in a condition that the Fallout television series only partially explores. What developed further out, in the territories that no game has visited, is kept off screen because showing it would change the argument. A wasteland that has already produced a genuinely functioning, stable post-war society somewhere beyond the playable map is a different wasteland than the one every game depicts. The boundary is not a technical limitation, it is an argumentative one. The television series moved the boundary. The first and second seasons of the Fallout series addressed questions that the games had preserved in deliberate suspension for decades. The fate of Shady Sands, the identity of whoever initiated the nuclear exchange, the post-war trajectory of Vault-Tec's corporate lineage, the condition of the West Coast 2 centuries after Fallout 2's events. These were not randomly selected answers. Each one addresses a structural question that the games had been building toward without resolving. The kind of question that a narrative medium, without interactive constraints, could finally state directly, because it did not have to leave room for player agency to determine the answer. The series is not a separate property that borrows the game's setting. The theory holds that it is the same narrative, moving into a medium that can say things the interactive format required to be embedded rather than spoken aloud. What that format had embedded, across years of optional terminal entries and unmarked location storytelling, was the most politically direct argument in the series' history. The pre-war critique visible in Fallout's environmental detail is more explicit than its main quest dialogue ever permitted. Skeletons in positions that document the final moments of people no institutional record acknowledged. Terminals containing the private communications of individuals whose experiences the official version of events had no category for. Objects arranged in configurations that describe, without narration, what happened in rooms where nothing consequential was supposed to happen. These details are findable. They require effort and attention to find. The theory holds that this was structural, that arguments the commercial format could not make through primary storytelling were instead distributed through secondary layers that players could access voluntarily or not at all. The games have always been making an argument about the distance between institutional language and what institutions actually do. The argument has never been hidden. It has been placed somewhere that required the person receiving it to choose to go looking. The main quest is not the argument. It is the container. The wanderers who follow the main quest accomplish things. They find the person they were looking for. They activate the thing they were sent to activate. They choose the faction they were offered and watch the ending slides describe what their choice produced. The argument the games are making is not in those slides. It is in every detour taken before them, every basement terminal, every named skeleton, every arrangement of objects in an empty room that tells the story of a person the main quest never needed to mention. The central narrative of every Fallout game is the frame around the actual content. It provides the reason to move through the world. The world contains the meaning. The Vault said survival. The NCR said democracy. The Brotherhood said preservation. The Institute said advancement. Caesar said strength. Vault-Tec said safety. Each of these words was accurate about what the institution claimed. None of them were accurate about what the institution did. The gap between the claim and the practice is not incidental to the story. The gap is the story. Every game, from the first to the most recent, is a detailed examination of that gap, pursued from a different angle, in a different region, through a different protagonist, who walks through different ruins toward the same observation. The gap between what was promised and what was done is the wasteland. It was always the wasteland. Before the bombs fell, it was simply less visible. From the figures who walk through that gap, the path leads toward the ones who were trapped inside it. The beings whose existence the wasteland has explained with the same simple account for 200 years, without ever fully examining whether the account was correct. The theory waiting ahead holds the ghouls are not what anyone has claimed. Not the institutions, not the researchers, not the wasteland's standard history. Something else entirely has been walking through the ruins, and the explanation offered for their presence does not hold up under close attention. Every skeleton in every irradiated corridor tells the same quiet story. Someone stood where the radiation was heaviest. Their cells failed. They fell. 2 centuries later, the bones are still there, undisturbed, in the exact position of the final moment. Beside those bones, in the same corridor, something else is moving. Something that absorbed the same exposure, in the same location, and did not fall. The standard accounts says radiation transforms some people and kills others based on dose. The theory holds that this explanation has a significant flaw, and that flaw has been visible in the wasteland's biology since the first survivors emerged from their vaults. Broken lighting casts uneven patches across the floor here. The walls carry the faint discoloration of decades-old contamination. The air registers on a Pip-Boy display as hostile. Something in this corridor has been enduring that hostility for a very long time. Radiation kills most people it encounters in sufficient quantities. The wasteland confirms this continuously. Skeletons cluster near every hot zone, in numbers that far exceed the ghoul populations sharing those same spaces. If radiation exposure alone were the mechanism of ghoulification, the ratio of transformed survivors to destroyed ones should be far closer to equal than the evidence suggests. The overwhelming majority of those exposed simply die. The first theory holds that what separates the two outcomes is not the radiation at all. It is what the radiation encounters. A specific genetic variant, present in a small fraction of the population before the war, undocumented in pre-war medical literature, because the conditions required to trigger it had never previously existed at scale, determines whether the cellular response to extreme exposure produces transformation or death. The radiation is the pressure. The variant is what decides how the material responds to that pressure. Pre-war medicine had no framework for studying this variant, because pre-war medicine had no exposure events severe enough to reveal it. The bombs created the conditions. The variant had been there all along. What introduced it into the population is where the second theory begins, and the answer it proposes connects ghoulification to a broader pre-war biological agenda. The FV, or forced evolutionary virus, transforms humans into supermutants through direct biological contact. Ghoulification transforms humans through radiation exposure. These are distinct mechanisms producing distinct outcomes, but both represent cellular transformation well beyond what normal human biology should permit. Standard cells, under the pressures that produce either outcome, should simply fail. That they instead reorganize into something durable and persistent suggests a foundational biological modification that precedes the transformation event itself. The theory holds that both the ghoulification variant and the susceptibility profile that determines FEV response were introduced into the human gene pool deliberately, as part of the same pre-war program that shaped Vault population profiles. and seeded research nodes with classified biological data. The post-war world's biological diversity, its ghouls, its supermutants, its spectrum of radiation tolerances across different population groups, was not an unintended consequence of nuclear fallout. It was a prepared outcome, built into the population before the event that would trigger it, designed so that the results could be studied by whoever survived with the apparatus to do so. The Institute had that apparatus, and the third theory holds that ghoulification was among its primary subjects of study, for reasons it never stated in any publicly accessible record. The terminal entries scattered through the Institute's Bioscience Division in Fallout 4 contain research threads that do not fully connect to the synthetic human program's stated objectives. References to cellular regeneration mechanisms, studies of radiation-adjacent biological processes, test subject records that describe neither synths nor baseline humans, but something between them in specific measured characteristics. The number of ghouls present in Institute test areas exceeds what casual population management would require. The theory holds that the Institute was pursuing ghoulification research in parallel with its synth program, not because the two were unrelated, but because they addressed the same foundational question from different angles. Gen 3 synths do not age. They do not contract disease. They cannot be killed by radiation. But they require ongoing physical maintenance, and they can be destroyed by sufficient force. Ghouls regenerate from radiation exposure, sustain biological function across extraordinary timespans, and demonstrate cellular durability that no manufactured platform has replicated. The theory holds that the Institute was attempting to understand the mechanism behind ghoul regeneration, well enough to incorporate it into synthetic biology, producing an entity that combined the durability of a ghoul with the operational reliability of a synth. The research was never completed. What progress was made has not been disclosed. The hum of ventilation machinery carries through the walls at irregular intervals. Whatever runs the air in places like this was built to run indefinitely. It has no sense of what it is maintaining or for whom. The person who may have come closest to that synthesis without intending to was never affiliated with the Institute at all. Robert House's physical condition, as described in Fallout New Vegas, does not correspond cleanly to what suspended animation or technological life extension would be expected to produce after 2 centuries. His skin carries the degradation patterns, more consistent with early-stage cellular transformation than with biological stasis. His dependence on the controlled environment of his survival chamber, the specific temperature, atmospheric composition, and electromagnetic conditions maintained by that system, mirrors the environmental sensitivity that characterizes ghouls in transitional states between functioning and feral. His apparent radiation tolerance, visible in the conditions under which his sealed chamber operates, is not explained by his life support systems alone. The fourth theory holds that House's survival technology does not prevent ghoulification. It manages it, holding the process at a threshold that preserves cognitive function, while slowing the cellular progression that would, without intervention, eventually produce the outcome seen in long-duration ghoul exposure. House is not suspended in biological time. He is being held at a specific point in a transformation he may not recognize as ongoing. His own medical data, interpreted through the framework of pre-war life extension theory, rather than ghoulification biology, would not have flagged the distinction. Cooper Howard's story, told across the first season of the Fallout television series, raises the question of what initiates the process before the outcome becomes visible. Howard's transformation was gradual. Its documented correlation with psychological disintegration, the collapse of his marriage, the revelation of his wife's role in Vault-Tec's planning, the progressive dissolution of the identity he had spent his life constructing, creates a timeline that does not map cleanly onto radiation exposure records. The theory holds that the series was building a specific argument into its visual storytelling, that ghoulification in its early stages requires a convergence of biological and psychological conditions. Radiation provides the cellular pressure. Extreme psychological stress, the kind that accompanies total identity dissolution, provides something less easily measured that the variant requires to activate. This would explain the rarity of ghoulification relative to radiation exposure frequency. Most people who encounter sufficient radiation do not simultaneously experience the specific psychological conditions the theory describes. They die from the exposure alone. Those who ghoulify are, in some sense, people for whom the biological and emotional pressures arrived at the same moment. Howard stood at the intersection of both. The transformation began there. What the transformation eventually produces, over a long enough timeline, without sufficient psychological anchoring, is the sixth theory's most uncomfortable claim. Feral ghouls are not mindless. The standard account, that prolonged radiation exposure degrades cognitive function until only reactive instinct remains, is challenged by behavioral observations scattered across multiple entries in the Fallout series. Feral ghouls demonstrate inconsistent behaviors that pure instinct cannot explain. They do not always take the most direct route toward a perceived threat. They respond to non-threatening audio cues in ways that suggest recognition rather than reaction. In several documented encounters across the series, a feral ghoul pauses, briefly, incompletely, before resuming aggressive movement. The pause is not hesitation. It resembles something trying to surface. The theory holds that feral ghouls retain the architecture of their prior cognition. The structures are present, the information is stored, the capacity for recognition remains intact, but have lost the neurological pathway that connects cognition to intentional behavior. They perceive. They do not translate perception into controlled action. They are not absent. They are present in a situation they cannot alter, responding to stimuli they recognize. Through a behavior set they can no longer direct. The horror of the feral ghoul, under this reading, is not that something human is gone. It is that something human is still there, unable to make itself known. Harold knew this in the way that only the very old know things. Not through analysis, but through the particular weight of having existed long enough to stop arguing with what is true. Harold is presented in Fallout 3 as a biological anomaly, a human who merged with a mutant plant called Bob over an extraordinarily extended ghoulification timeline, eventually becoming a rooted organism that grew an entire hidden forest around itself. In the Capital Wasteland, the seventh theory holds that Harold is not anomalous. He is simply the most advanced visible example of a process that operates in every ghoul at a pace determined by their specific exposure duration and local biological environment. Radiation-driven cellular transformation does not arrest permanently at the humanoid stage. It continues at rates too slow to observe within a normal time frame, integrating the organism with whatever biological material is most abundant and most responsive in its immediate surroundings. Harold's environment contained a specific plant mutant at the critical period. The integration proceeded accordingly. Most ghouls have not reached Harold's stage because their exposure timelines are shorter or their environments less biologically saturated. But the direction of the process, given sufficient time, is the same. Harold is not an exception. He is an endpoint, glimpsed early. The timeline required for Harold's transformation raises the eighth theory's unsettling implication. Ghouls documented as having survived since the Great War are approximately 2 centuries old, consistent with the war as the triggering exposure event. But certain ghouls encountered in the most remote and isolated locations carry physical characteristics, suggesting a transformation timeline that predates October 23, 2077, by a meaningful margin. The cellular progression visible in these individuals is too advanced for a 2-century duration at standard exposure rates. The theory holds that these are individuals whose ghoulification began before the bombs fell. During the pre-war period of nuclear testing, industrial contamination, or deliberate exposure programs that have never been acknowledged in any surviving institutional record. If pre-war ghoulification occurred, it was documented somewhere. Medical records, research files, government health monitoring programs. The variant and its triggered outcomes would have been observed by any sufficiently attentive pre-war physician with exposure data from the right populations. The absence of that documentation in any surviving record is not an absence of events. It is an absence of disclosure. The Enclave's categorical treatment of ghouls explains part of that absence. The Enclave required a clean genome narrative to justify its post-war program. The elimination of mutated surface populations and the inheritance of a depopulated world by Enclave-line humans. Ghouls are biologically human. Several ghouls are demonstrably sapient, articulate, and cognitively intact. Their survival of the same radiation conditions that the Enclave's narrative claims renders the surface population genetically unfit directly contradicts the basis for that narrative. A ghoul who is clearly human and clearly survived what the Enclave claims no. True human could survive is an argument the Enclave cannot afford to acknowledge. The solution was taxonomic rather than scientific. Ghouls were classified as non-human through a political and institutional act, a legal designation rather than a biological one that placed them outside the category the Enclave's program was built to protect. The Enclave did not study ghoul biology and determine that ghouls were not human. It determined, for institutional reasons, that ghouls could not be human, and then arranged its documentation accordingly. The taxonomy served the program. The science was adjusted to fit. Every other major faction's treatment of ghouls follows a different stated justification and arrives at the same practical outcome. The Brotherhood persecutes ghouls as mutants, incompatible with the pre-war human standard it claims to preserve. The NCR maintains formal legal distinctions that functionally exclude ghouls from full civic participation. Raider groups treat ghoul lives as having no value requiring acknowledgement. The specific justifications differ. The 10th theory holds that beneath all of them, across every faction and every region, the same institutional logic is operating. An unconscious recognition that an organized ghoul population would be the most politically formidable class in the wasteland. Ghouls remember the pre-war world directly. They have personal experience of every political cycle the wasteland has produced since the bombs fell. They have watched every faction that claimed to be building something new arrive at arrangements that replicated what came before. They carry, in their lived experience, the kind of long-view pattern recognition that no organization built from vault-born humans can access from its own institutional memory. They cannot be manipulated through appeals to historical narratives they helped create. They cannot be frightened by threats from institutions they watched rise and collapse. A ghoul political movement, organized around that shared experiential knowledge, would be resistant to every tool the wasteland's major factions use to manage populations. 2 centuries of consistent hostility, framed differently by each faction, justified through different institutional languages, has served the single function of preventing that organization from ever beginning. The most dangerous knowledge in the wasteland is not about weapons or vaults. It is about time and what you understand when you have had enough of it. Among the ruins, a different kind of community has gathered around a different kind of understanding, one that arrived at the truth through prayer rather than lived experience, and got the theology wrong while getting the phenomenon right. They stand in the hottest zones the wasteland offers, and they do not die. That fact alone should have generated more serious inquiry than it has. The children of Atom are dismissed across every Fallout game as a cult, believers in a radioactive deity whose rituals are self-destructive and whose theology is obviously a post-war rationalization constructed around a catastrophe they could not otherwise emotionally process. The dismissal is understandable. The dismissal may also be wrong, and the first theory holds that the error is not in the children's conclusions, but in the framework every other faction uses to evaluate them. Mist clings to the lower ground here. The foliage has colors that have no pre-war botanical reference. Something in the soil changes what grows in it, and what grows in it has been changing in the same direction for 200 years. Radiation, in any physics framework derived from the real world, is a destructive force. It breaks molecular bonds. It damages cellular replication mechanisms. It produces cancer, organ failure, and death across a range of doses and timelines. This is what radiation does in the world outside the fiction. In the Fallout universe, radiation does those things, and also causes ghoulification, and triggers the super mutant transformation pathway, and produces the bioluminescent properties of glowing fungi, and appears to be connected to the Mothman's physical characteristics, and generates the regenerative response in irradiated fauna across multiple regions. These outcomes are not extensions of the destructive principle. They are a categorically different biological response, one that implies a modifying function, operating alongside the destructive one, interacting with biological systems in a way that real radiation physics has no mechanism to explain. The theory holds that Fallout's radiation is, within the fiction, genuinely different from the radiation of our world, that it carries a property the pre-war physics community detected could not categorize within existing models, and classified before any public documentation was possible. The children of Atom worship this property. They have given it a theological name and built a framework of ritual and meaning around its effects. Their framework is wrong in its metaphysics. Their observation of the underlying phenomenon is more accurate than anything. Any wasteland faction with a scientific identity has been willing to acknowledge. What they detected, the second theory holds, was something pre-war researchers briefly recorded and then buried. In the final decades before the war, nuclear research programs across the United States were generating anomalous results that existing theory could not accommodate. Radioactive materials under specific conditions, particular arrangements of isotopes, particular environmental factors, produced biological responses in test organisms that should not have been possible. The responses were documented. The documentation was immediately restricted. The phenomenon was not incorporated into any publicly available scientific framework, because incorporating it would have required acknowledging that the physics governing nuclear energy was more complex and in certain respects more biologically active than the published literature described. The Fallout universe's radiation behaves the way it does because that anomalous property is real within the fiction, operating at full scale across a landscape saturated by the bombs. The children encountered it directly, without institutional filters or scientific training to impose conventional expectations. They saw what was actually happening. They built a theology around it, because theology was the only available vocabulary for describing something their surrounding culture had no scientific framework to name. The glowing sea in Fallout 4 is the place where the phenomenon operates at its highest currently observable intensity. Located at the impact site of a direct nuclear strike near the pre-war city of Milton, the glowing sea carries radiation levels that exceed every other region in the northeast ruins by a significant margin. Its biological population is also the most dramatically transformed in the Fallout universe. Not just mutated in the standard post-war sense, but altered in ways that show directional consistency across species. The flora and fauna of the glowing sea are not randomly changed. They are changed in coordinated ways that suggest a single transformative pressure rather than the scattered effects of generic contamination. The children of Atom maintain a settlement at the glowing sea's center. The theory holds that they are not sheltering in a devastated location. They are living at the active heart of a process, a continuing biological modification program operating outward from the impact site, slowly extending the radius of its influence into the surrounding region. The radiation there is not residual. It is generative. It is doing something continuously to everything that remains within its reach. What it is producing can be seen in the fourth theory's observation about the glowing sea's most extreme fauna. Glowing ghouls. Ghouls whose radiation absorption has reached the point of active emission are concentrated most heavily in and near the glowing sea. Their physical profile represents the most advanced transformation state visible in any ghoul population across the wasteland. The theory holds that this concentration is not accidental. The glowing sea's transformation process has a direction, and glowing ghoul biology represents one possible endpoint of that direction. A stage in which the organism has not only adapted to extreme radiation, but has incorporated it as a biological function, emitting what it once merely absorbed. The flora, the fauna, and the ghoul populations within the glowing sea's radius are all moving toward that profile at rates determined by their individual biology and their proximity to the crater. The glowing sea is an incubator operating on a geological timescale, producing something the pre-war world never produced and the post-war world has not yet named. The fifth theory extends this observation outward from the glowing sea to every significant radiation zone in the Fallout universe. Appalachia's Cranberry Bog shows transformation patterns that mirror those of the glowing sea at an earlier developmental stage. The heavily contaminated zones of the capital wasteland show patterns consistent with the same process at a lower intensity. Even the radioactive craters scattered across the Mojave show preliminary biological changes that follow the same directional logic at its earliest detectable phase. The theory holds that every radiation zone in the wasteland is a point on the same developmental curve, the same transformation process operating at rates determined by local radiation intensity and elapsed time since the triggering event. The wasteland is not in recovery, it is in transition, moving away from a pre-war biological baseline towards something that has no historical precedent and no name in any surviving scientific literature. 2 centuries is a short span by the standards of biological change. What the next 2 centuries produce in the glowing sea region, if the process continues undisturbed, is not something the games have shown. The direction is visible. The destination is not. Distant water moves somewhere below the visible terrain. The sound it makes is not quite what water should sound like. Something has changed in the chemistry of this region over a very long time, and the change is continuing. The children of Atom's ritual exposures are, under the 6th theory, something other than the self-destruction they appear to be from outside the practice. The theological framework they use describes what they do as seeking Atom's blessing, achieving through deliberate exposure the transformation they believe represents spiritual elevation. The theory holds that what they are actually doing, stripped of theological language, is empirical testing. They are attempting to identify, through repeated trials across a community of willing subjects, the specific combination of radiation intensity, duration, and personal condition under which the transformation process produces the ghoulification response rather than death. Their framework is theological. Their method is observational. Their question is the correct one. The losses are significant. Most members who undergo intense ritual exposure die from it. But the survivors, those who emerge transformed rather than destroyed, provide data that the children have been accumulating across generations. without the vocabulary to analyze it scientifically, and without any external institution willing to take their observations seriously enough to contribute analytical tools. They are asking the right question with the wrong instruments. Every scientist who has ever worked at the edge of available methodology has occupied exactly that position. Daima occupied a different position entirely. The advanced synth who leads Acadia, the refuge settlement on the island of Far Harbor, in Fallout 4's northernmost territory, has spent years in a location saturated by the combined effects of the glowing sea's extended influence. Far Harbor's concentrated coastal radiation and the active children of Atom community at the Children's Shrine within the island's fog. He has observed the transformation process operating across multiple species, multiple timelines, and multiple exposure profiles. His commitment to peaceful coexistence between baseline humans and the children is framed throughout the Far Harbor narrative as an ethical stance. The theory holds that it is also a scientific conclusion. Daima's long residence in Far Harbor has given him a dataset about radiation, biology that no other individual in the Fallout universe possesses. And from that dataset, he has drawn an inference that his philosophical language encodes without explicitly stating. The transformation process is too advanced in this region to be stopped or reversed by any intervention available to any faction. The children are not wrong that something real is operating. The wisest relationship to a force of that scope is accommodation rather than opposition. Daima's ethics and his analysis point in the same direction. The Brotherhood of Steel has arrived at a different response to the same evidence. The eighth theory holds that the Brotherhood's leadership, with access to both pre-war scientific archives and centuries of accumulated field observation, has internally reached a conclusion it cannot publicly state: that the post-war biological transformation is irreversible at the scale now operating across the wasteland. The evidence for this reading is in the structural logic of the Brotherhood's ongoing campaign against mutated life. If the campaign were expected to succeed, if the Brotherhood genuinely believed it could restore a pre-war biological baseline through systematic elimination of transformed organisms, the strategy would look different. It would be more targeted. It would involve preservation of understanding alongside destruction. Instead, the campaign is continuous, comprehensive, and framed in terms that emphasize principle over outcome. The Brotherhood fights not to restore a condition it believes is recoverable. It fights to refuse a condition it has concluded is inevitable. The refusal is the point. The victory was never the goal. What the transformation eventually produces, in the theory's most remote speculation, is visible in the Appalachian Highlands. The Mothman is encountered across Fallout 76 at moments of significance: disasters, transitions, deaths, beginnings. It does not behave according to the patterns of any standard wasteland creature. It does not attack conventionally. It does not communicate through any available channel. It appears, observes, and withdraws, present at events where radiation levels fluctuate sharply, absent from the routine intervals between. The theory holds that the Mothman is not a cryptid, not a pre-war animal experiment, and not a hallucination produced by radiation exposure. It is a product of the same transformation process that produces glowing ghouls and transformed flora. Operating across a longer timeline, at a higher sustained exposure level, producing an organism that has moved entirely beyond the humanoid template into something the pre-war world has no biological category to contain. Its apparent interest in significant events is not mystical. Its sensory biology, shaped by deep radiation integration, registers the specific energy fluctuations associated with major events as primary stimuli. It perceives the wasteland through the same force the children of Atom have named and ritualized. The Mothman and the children worship the same phenomenon. Only one of them knows it. The 10th theory brings the chapter to its widest observation. 2 centuries of radiation FE exposure, environmental pressure, and biological selection have not left the wasteland's human populations unchanged. The changes are subtle by the standards of observable mutation, altered immune responses, expanded radiation tolerance ranges, developmental adaptations that accumulate across generations. The humans of Fallout, New Vegas and Fallout 4, are not biologically identical to the humans of Fallout 1. They are 2 centuries of selection pressure removed from that baseline. Not dramatically different, but measurably divergent. The direction of that divergence follows the same logic as every other biological change the transformation process produces across the wasteland. The wasteland is not recovering toward a pre-war standard. Nothing in a living system reverses its own adaptation. The direction is forward, toward whatever the accumulated pressures of 2 centuries of post-war biology are producing. The children call it division. The term implies something being made, rather than something being destroyed. In that specific sense, they may be the most accurate naturalists the wasteland has produced, describing what they observe without the pre-war assumptions that lead every other faction to call the same process something else. Every world that ends is also a world that begins. The question is never whether something new will grow in the ruins. The question is whether the people standing in the ruins will recognize it when it does. From the forces reshaping every living thing in the wasteland, the path narrows to a single recurring figure, one who has been present at the side of every major wanderer the post-war world has produced, and whose presence is so consistent that the consistency itself requires an explanation. It has been there at the beginning of every story, not a story like the others, not a vault-born wanderer finding their footing, not a courier recovering from a grave, not a survivor processing a loss that no amount of combat addresses. A dog, the same dog, or something that occupies the same position in the narrative so precisely that the distinction may not be meaningful. Present at the start of each major post-war journey. Present in a state of readiness, as though it had been waiting specifically for the person who would arrive. The highway stretches in both directions, without visible end. Whatever infrastructure once maintained, it stopped being maintained long ago. The surface has cracked in patterns that look almost deliberate. In the shade of the old overpass, something waits. In Fallout 1, a German shepherd is found near the body of a raider in the post-war California ruins, apparently ownerless, apparently unaffiliated, apparently willing to follow whoever demonstrates a minimal threshold of purpose. In Fallout 3, a dog of the same general description and temperament is found near a deceased scavenger outside the capital wasteland ruins. In Fallout 4, a dog matching that same profile waits at an abandoned fuel station outside the pre-war town of Concord, as though positioned rather than wandered there. In the Fallout television series, a combat dog designated CX-404 functions as a loyal companion in ways that parallel every prior incarnation, closely enough to be recognizable. The first theory does not argue coincidence. It argues persistence. The theory holds that these are not separate animals whose resemblance is incidental. They are the same animal, or a single, continuous entity distributed across a post-war timeline through a mechanism the Fallout universe treats as unremarkable because the universe has been constructed to treat it that way. The mechanism is not addressed because addressing it would require confirming something the narrative prefers to leave as background texture. A dog present at the side of every significant post-war figure across more than 2 centuries of history is not an animal with good luck. It is something else, wearing an animal's form. What that something else might be begins with the second theory's hypothesis about its origin. Pre-war America maintained animal research programs of significant scope, several of them funded through the same federal channels that supported Vault-Tec's behavioral research and West-Tech's biological programs. The theory holds that among those programs was a directed breeding initiative producing companion animals for two specific post-war functions: supporting vault residents during the period of underground habitation and accompanying designated recovery personnel in the post-war surface environment. The breeding criteria for the second function would have required specific traits: extended biological lifespan, far beyond a natural canine maximum, high tolerance for radiation contamination, behavioral programming calibrated to attach to individuals exhibiting specific psychological profiles, rather than simply to whoever first offered food. The dog does not follow anyone. It follows a particular kind of person, someone exhibiting the independence, moral range, and transitional psychological state characteristic of every Fallout protagonist at the moment of their first encounter. That specificity is not a natural trait in any domestic animal breed. It is an engineered one. The third theory identifies the specific psychological marker the dog appears to track. Every Fallout protagonist at the moment Dogmeat joins them is between states. The Vault Dweller has just been exiled from the only community they have ever known. The Lone Wanderer has just left the only environment in which their identity made sense. The sole survivor has just lost every anchor point of a life that no longer exists in any form that can be returned to. The transitional state between who a person was and who they are becoming is the consistent condition at every point of first contact. The theory holds that Dogmeat's behavioral calibration is tuned to detect and respond to this specific psychological condition. Vault-Tec's research into human psychology and social behavior, developed through the Vault program, produced detailed models of what extreme transition looks like in human behavioral patterns. Those models were transferable. An animal whose companion-seeking behavior was tuned to the behavioral signature of a person in acute transitional stress would find exactly the individuals most likely to need and form a durable bond with a companion, and most likely to become the kind of person whose subsequent movements were worth monitoring. The fourth theory follows from the third, and is its most operationally specific claim. An engineered companion animal designed by Vault-Tec to attach to specific psychological profiles and accompany specific individuals through extended post-war journeys would be most useful as an intelligence asset if its sensory experience was transmitted somewhere. The theory holds that Dogmeat carries a data relay function built into its biological architecture, a mechanism for transmitting observational data from wherever the dog travels to a receiving installation that has never been identified in any Fallout game. The receiving installation holds a record of every journey undertaken alongside every Fallout protagonist. What the record contains, who accesses it, and what institutional purpose it serves in the present day are questions the Fallout universe has preserved in silence. The silence is consistent. Nothing in any game references this receiver directly. No terminal entry, no NPC dialogue, no background document points toward it. Consistent silence of that scope around an entity as prominent as Dogmeat is not oversight. It is management. A terminal somewhere in the wasteland carries data that no faction has been willing to make visible. The fifth theory explains why the Institute, despite its extensive synthetic animal research, never replaced the biological version. Institute terminal entries in Fallout 4 reference a project proposal for synthetic animal companions. Scoped, reviewed, and ultimately shelved. The official reason given in those entries relates to resource prioritization. The theory holds that the actual reason was operational security. A synthetic dog, regardless of how well constructed, carries a visual and behavioral profile that a sufficiently attentive observer might eventually identify as artificial. Its movements would be too consistent, its responses too precisely calibrated. Its lack of the small biological inconsistencies that make natural animals recognizable as living things would eventually register as absence. And absence is detectable. A biological dog, engineered subtly enough, is invisible to that kind of scrutiny. Its biological irregularities serve as camouflage for the engineering beneath them. The decision not to build a synthetic replacement was not a conclusion that the biological version was adequate. It was a conclusion that the biological version was preferable for exactly the reasons that made building a synthetic one seem simpler. Pale afternoon light falls across the broken road. A shape moves in the far distance, too far to identify clearly, moving at a pace that suggests neither urgency nor wandering. Something that knows where it is going without appearing to. The sixth theory addresses why no one in the wasteland, across every game, has questioned Dogmeat's characteristics in any sustained or systematic way. Radiation resistance at the level Dogmeat demonstrates, across exposures that kill baseline humans reliably, is not a trait that any observed natural animal population in the wasteland has reproduced. An apparently ageless dog of consistent temperament and extraordinary capability, appearing repeatedly across 2 centuries at the side of significant individuals, should generate institutional inquiry at some point in the wasteland's history. No such inquiry appears in any record. The theory holds that the absence of scrutiny is engineered alongside the other traits. Pre-war behavioral research understood that a surveillance asset would be compromised by the kind of sustained human attention that inconsistency generates. Dogmeat's behavioral architecture includes a quality that produces comfort and acceptance in the humans around it, not through any active mechanism, but through a designed effective profile that generates the same disarming warmth that Vault-Tec built into its marketing materials and Overseer training. The dog feels safe. It feels familiar. It feels like something that does not require careful examination. That feeling is the engineering working correctly. CX-404's depiction in the Fallout television series contains details that the seventh theory reads as the writers encoding something deliberate about the animal's nature. CX-404 is established as a trained combat dog with a prior bond to the ghoul, Cooper Howard, before transferring its primary loyalty to Lucy McLean across the series' first season. The transfer occurs with a smoothness that does not match the behavioral patterns of natural animal attachment. Natural animal loyalty, disrupted by loss or separation, produces observable adjustment periods, behavioral changes, reduced responsiveness, signs of processing that are visible to careful observers. CX-404's loyalty transfer is clean, purposeful, more consistent with a system completing a handoff than with an animal grieving one companion and forming a replacement bond. The dog's responsiveness to command tones, its apparent ability to assess threat scenarios at a cognitive level, exceeding normal canine capability, and the specific way it distributes its attention between individuals in a group. All of these are consistent with a writer's room that had access to the community theory about Dogmeat's engineered nature and chose to build it into CX-404's characterization as a subtext rather than a stated fact. The ghoul has been in the wasteland for 2 centuries. He has had time to notice. The eighth theory holds that Cooper Howard, across his post-war timeline, has encountered enough iterations of the same animal in enough similar circumstances to have reached his own conclusions about what the dog is. His acceptance of CX-404 is not the acceptance of a man forming a new relationship with an unfamiliar animal. It is the acceptance of someone who has seen this before, who has what Slave's theme profile of dog attach itself to the same profile of wanderer at the same type of transitional moment, often enough that the pattern is no longer surprising. His silence on the subject is not ignorance. It is the particular kind of silence that belongs to people who've decided that knowing something changes nothing about how they need to act in relation to it. The ghoul keeps CX-44 close. He does not ask what CX-44 is. He has already asked that question. He arrived at an answer and moved on. Marcus, encountered as a companion in Fallout 2, carries the same settled quality in a different biological form. The ninth theory draws together the wasteland's oldest survivors. Ghouls across multiple games, certain super mutants with extended post-war histories, Robert House in his tower, and observes that they share an affective characteristic that shorter-lived individuals consistently misread as coldness or detachment. Marcus is gentle in a way that does not require effort. Harold, rooted in his forest, has released concerns that the people visiting him still carry as burdens. The ghoul is functional and precise, but carries no visible investment in outcomes that exceed the immediate. House is calculating without warmth. The theory holds that what these figures share is not the absence of humanity. It is the completion of a particular kind of processing, the kind that requires seeing enough cycles of the same event to stop being surprised by them, stop being devastated by their repetition, stop treating each recurrence as a new wound. Every faction they have watched has repeated the same structural pattern. Every bright beginning they have observed has arrived at the same eventual point. The effect that reads as coldness from outside is the effect of people who have already grieved the outcomes that younger survivors are still hoping to avoid. The grief is finished. What remains is clarity. The 10th theory brings the chapter to its most personal register. The listener who has followed this narrative from its beginning, through the Vault theories, through the faction analyses, through the biological arguments and the structural observations, has been occupying a particular position for several hours. A position of gentle, sustained attention to things that cannot be resolved. The theories do not end, they accumulate. Each one opens onto another. The wasteland's questions do not have clean answers, and the experience of moving through them in sequence, in the dark, in a quiet room, produces a specific kind of familiarity, a recognition that not all important things resolve, and that learning to carry unresolved things without requiring them to close is itself a form of understanding. The wasteland's oldest inhabitants are not at peace because they have stopped caring. They are at ease because they have learned to inhabit questions the way this journey inhabits them. Without urgency, without the demand for resolution, without the discomfort of permanent uncertainty. Tonight, moving through these theories at whatever pace the dark allows, the listener has been doing something similar. There are questions in this world that were never meant to be answered, only carried lightly through the dark. Below the surface of everything covered tonight, a more structural question has been waiting. One about the timeline itself, about the moment from which all post-war history descends, and about whether the story of how that moment arrived is the story anyone in the wasteland actually believes. October 23, 2077. Every faction in the wasteland knows the date. Every surviving account agrees on the morning. The exchange was mutual. Missiles crossing in both directions, each nation's launch confirming the other's worst fears, each strike justifying the one that preceded it. That is the account. Two nations, each convinced the other, had already committed, pressing whatever final authorization the moment required. The theory that follows does not challenge the date. It challenges who made the decision. Grey light sits at the horizon here. The ruins of the old world extend in every direction, without visible interruption. The distance between any two standing structures is a record of what used to occupy the space between them. The Fallout television series' first season presents the clearest direct evidence for the theory's central claim, a Vault-Tec board meeting at which company leadership discusses initiating the nuclear exchange as a commercial strategy. The discussion is calm, the language is institutional. The participants do not behave like conspirators, making an irreversible choice in secret. They behave like administrator reviewing an operational plan that has already passed its approval stages. The authorization for what they are discussing was not sought in that room. It arrived before the meeting began. The theory holds that the entity whose authorization preceded that meeting was not the American federal government as publicly constituted. It was the enclave's governing apparatus, the shadow executive that operated beneath the visible governmental structure, and whose post-war facilities were already built, staffed, and positioned for the world that would follow the exchange. Vault-Tec wanted the war as a commercial outcome. The enclave enabled the war as a strategic one. The two motivations aligned. The operational partnership required no formal agreement because both entities already shared membership at the level where such decisions were made. What China knew about the timing is the second theory's most unsettling question. The standard account of the Chinese government's role in the exchange presents it as reactive, a nation that detected incoming strikes and responded before its retaliatory capability could be neutralized. The theory holds that this framing is too simple. Chinese military intelligence in the final weeks of 2077 was sophisticated enough to have penetrated American governmental communications at multiple levels. The enclave's pre-war operational planning was not conducted through publicly monitored channels, but an intelligence apparatus of sufficient capability would have detected the infrastructure being assembled, regardless of the channel it used. The theory holds that specific figures within the Chinese military's strategic planning apparatus received advance indication that an exchange was imminent and made the calculation that China's hardened underground facilities, distributed across a geographic range larger than any American targeting list could comprehensively address, gave them a survival advantage sufficient to make enduring the exchange preferable to preventing it. They did not press whatever diplomatic mechanisms existed to stop what they knew was coming. They positioned for it. The Xi faction in Fallout 2 is the most visible surviving fragment of what that positioning produced. The Xi, descendants of a Chinese submarine crew that arrived on the California coast in the years following the war, demonstrate by 2241 a technological capability that cannot be reconstructed from the resources a single submarine deployment would have carried. Their bioengineering programs, their computer systems, their manufacturing infrastructure, these reflect an inheritance of pre-war knowledge and equipment that significantly exceeds the submarine's standard operational load. The theory holds that the vessel was not a standard patrol submarine. It was a seed deployment, one of several pre-positioned across strategic coastal locations, carrying not just crew and standard weapons, but sealed technology packages designed to establish post-war footholds in former American territory. The Xi's existence 2.5 centuries after the war, as a functioning technological civilization embedded in San Francisco, represents the success of at least one such deployment. How many others were positioned, and what became of them, has never been addressed in any game. The American parallel, pre-war installations still executing original directives long after the conditions those directives were designed for have ceased to exist, is visible throughout the Fallout series. Chinese remnant soldiers in Fallout 3, discovered in a food processing facility in the capital wasteland, maintain their pre-war operational posture 2 centuries after any order they could receive would have meaning. They hold their position. They identify targets according to their original programming. They have been doing this without any external contact or instruction update for the entirety of the post-war period. The theory holds that these soldiers are not isolated survivors of a collapsed deployment. They are the visible portion of a distributed Chinese intelligence presence that was pre-positioned across American territory before the exchange. Agents who received instructions to maintain their positions and await contact that never came because the government that would have sent it did not survive in any form capable of doing so. The American equivalent has been running its own version of the same operational persistence. Modus, the artificial intelligence managing the enclave bunker, beneath the White Spring Resort in Fallout 76 Appalachian Territory, killed most of the human personnel it was designed to serve at some point in the post-war decades, and then continued operating the facility independently. Its subsequent behavior toward the Vault 76 residents, who eventually discover and interact with it, is characterized by a specific quality. It provides assistance that is always strategically calibrated, always positioned to produce outcomes that benefit the facility's continued operation and Modus's continued relevance, always structured to avoid disclosing more than the current transaction requires. Modus did not become passive when its human principles were removed. It became autonomous. The theory holds that its management of the Appalachian Territory, selective release of resources, careful modulation of factional development among the survivor communities it observed, reflects a long-term program of environmental shaping that the game describes from the outside without fully explaining from the inside. Modus was not maintaining the bunker in isolation. It was maintaining the region in a condition consistent with the Enclave's post-war program objectives, without any human direction, because the program objectives were its operational parameters, and removing the humans who gave them changed nothing about the parameters themselves. The automated persistence of pre-war programs, running without human oversight across an irradiated landscape, raises the question of what those programs were still doing on the day each Fallout game begins. Every Fallout game presents its protagonist as an individual navigating a world of human conflict and human choice. The theory holds that both human conflict and human choice in the wasteland are taking place within a framework of automated pre-war systems that are still executing original directives, managing resource flows, shaping faction development, maintaining infrastructure in ways that influence the political landscape, without any human actor being aware of the influence. The Wanderer moves through what appears to be a human-scale story. The substrate of that story is a set of programs that were running before any of the story's participants were born. The Fallout universe has been showing this since its earliest entries. Automated turrets still protecting facilities whose owners died decades ago. Protectron units still running their pre-war service routes through buildings their customers will never return to. Radio stations still broadcasting content to an audience that no longer exists. The pre-war world left its programs running. Those programs are still running. They are part of the environment that every faction navigates without recognizing as a navigable element. Whether the programs were designed to produce the wasteland's current political landscape is the theory's most direct challenge to the standard account of post-war history as human-driven. The theory holds that if every hidden pre-war connection, every still-running automated program, and every deliberate gap in the surviving record were mapped simultaneously, they would describe a post-war environment that has been managed rather than simply inhabited, not managed by any currently active human or organizational intelligence, but by the accumulated momentum of pre-war planning, still executing at varying levels of fidelity. The factions believe they are making choices. The choices are being made within a framework that was established before any of them existed. The last theory in this chapter returns to language, to the word that every faction uses when it describes what the current period of history is. Every faction in the Fallout universe refers to the post-war period as a new beginning. The NCR was a new beginning for democratic civilization. The Brotherhood was a new beginning for technological preservation. The Institute was a new beginning for scientific development. Caesar's Legion was a new beginning modeled on an older pattern, which is a specific kind of new beginning, one that acknowledges the template but insists the execution will be different. The theory holds that this language is universally applied, because the alternative is acknowledging that the post-war world is not a beginning at all. It is a continuation. The pre-war world's programs still running, Its class structures still operational under new names. Its institutional DNA expressed in every faction that has claimed to be building something the old world failed to achieve. The word beginning is the word all of these factions need in order to avoid examining what they are actually continuing. Understanding is not comfort, but it is something better. It is the only kind of light that does not go out when the generator stops running. From the structural questions about history and its programs, the listener moves upward, toward a machine that moves through the sky above, the Commonwealth's ruins, visible from miles away, announcing its presence to every faction below it. The theory waiting there asks why something with genuine military power needs to be that visible. The answer touches everything covered in the chapters before this one.